My son left for work one morning and never came back. 20 years later, I saw his face on the evening news. The anchor announced the upcoming merger of Vanguard Estates. The billionaire stepping up to the podium answered to the name Pierce Waverly. He wore a bespoke suit and spoke with a refined accent. He possessed the exact jagged scar above his left eyebrow that my son received falling off a bicycle in 1994. My son did not drown in the river 20 years ago. My son was buying commercial real estate in Manhattan. I turned off the television. I picked up my car keys. I drove straight to the city. My name is Dominic. I am 69 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to uncover a painful truth about someone you love. I parked my 10-year-old sedan across the street from the shimmering glass tower of Vanguard Estates. I bypassed the corporate security desk utilizing protocols I perfected during my 3 decades as a senior insurance fraud investigator. I walked with the steady pace of a man who belonged exactly where he stood. I took the service elevator down to the subterranean executive parking garage. The air smelled of expensive exhaust and damp concrete. I waited in the shadows beside a massive black luxury vehicle. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Pierce emerged into the dim light. He adjusted his silk tie. He laughed at something his assistant said. The sound of that laugh pierced my chest. I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. I called him by his real name. I called him Jordan. He stopped mid-stride. The blood drained completely from his face. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray under the fluorescent lights. The confident billionaire vanished instantly. The frightened boy I had raised stood before me. He stared at his African-American father. The silence stretched between us like a physical weight. He quickly turned to his assistant and ordered the man to leave the garage. He took a step backward. His fists clenched tightly at his sides. He demanded to know what I was doing in his private parking area. He stated firmly that Jordan was dead. He insisted I was a delusional vagrant looking for a quick payout. I did not raise my voice. I recited his social security number from memory. I described the exact location of the birthmark on his left shoulder. I told him a suit worth $3,000 could not hide the truth of his identity. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. 2 massive private security guards stepped out of the shadows. Pierce pointed directly at my chest. He ordered his men to remove the confused old man from the premises immediately. He turned his back on me to open his car door. The rejection was absolute. He chose to protect his empire over acknowledging his own flesh and blood. The passenger door of the luxury vehicle swung open before the guards could touch me. A woman stepped out onto the concrete. She was white, with icy blonde hair and an expression of pure disdain. I knew exactly who she was from the television broadcast. This was Audrey. She wore a tailored white designer dress. She assessed my worn leather jacket with a sweeping, calculating glance. She did not ask for my name. She did not ask why I was addressing her husband as my dead son. She simply opened her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. She marched directly into my personal space. She shoved the $5,000 hard against my chest. She commanded me to take the trash money and disappear back to whatever slum I had crawled out of. Her voice was sharp and devoid of any human empathy. She threatened to call the police right then and there. She promised to have me arrested and prosecuted for aggressive stalking if I ever approached her husband again. She told me I would rot in a city jail cell before anyone believed a single word I said. Pierce stood behind her in complete silence. He allowed his wife to humiliate the man who had taught him how to walk. I looked at Audrey. I saw the raw arrogance of a woman accustomed to buying her way out of every inconvenience. She believed my grief had a price tag. She assumed my silence could be purchased on a damp garage floor. She expected me to lower my head and walk away a richer man. She fundamentally misunderstood the man standing in front of her. I did not reach for the cash. I let the tightly bound stack of bills fall onto the ground. The money scattered across a dark puddle of motor oil. I looked directly into Audrey's cold eyes. I informed her that I did not come for her money. I came for my son. I turned away from their stunned faces. I walked toward the exit ramp without looking back. The security guards did not follow me. The sheer audacity of rejecting $5,000 in cash left them completely paralyzed. I walked with my head held high. I maintained the absolute composure required of my old profession. My heart pounded with the agonizing grief of a father who had just been discarded. My mind worked with the chilling precision of a seasoned investigator. As I approached the exit gate, my trained eyes caught the registration tag on the front bumper of Audrey's luxury vehicle. The custom license plate frame displayed the name of a private holding corporation. The name burned itself into my retinas. It was a corporate entity I had personally audited 20 years ago. During my tenure fighting insurance fraud, I had dismantled dozens of shell companies. This specific corporation belonged to a notorious family syndicate known for orchestrating massive financial illusions. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with violent clarity. My son had not simply run away from home to start a new life. He had not drowned by accident. He had committed a highly orchestrated federal crime. He had faked his own death to secure an enormous life insurance payout. He had used that stolen money to buy his way into a criminal empire. The tragedy of a missing son evaporated in the cold garage air. It was instantly replaced by the grim reality of federal fraud. I stepped out onto the busy city sidewalk. The blinding daylight hit my face. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I felt the familiar, thrilling pulse of a hunt. They thought they had successfully intimidated a confused, grieving father. They had no idea they had just provoked a man who spent his entire life hunting down ghosts and tearing apart financial lies. I pulled out my phone. I dialed the number of the one man I could trust to help me crack a 20-year-old conspiracy. The real war was just beginning. I crossed the busy avenue and checked into a neon-lit motel directly facing the Vanguard Estates tower. The small room smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. I did not need luxury. I needed a tactical vantage point. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and watched the billionaire's fortress through the rusted window blinds. My son was inside that towering fortress living a stolen life. I did not have time to grieve the boy I lost 20 years ago. I had to systematically hunt the ruthless man he had become. The flimsy wooden door of my motel room did not swing open with a polite knock. It was kicked inward with brutal, shattering force. The metal deadbolt tore completely through the wooden doorframe. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped into the cramped space. He did not look like a common street thug. He looked like an expensive corporate assassin. Two massive men in dark suits stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway behind him, completely blocking my only exit. The lawyer walked right up to me and slammed a thick legal folder onto the cheap mattress. He introduced himself as the senior counsel for Vanguard Estates. He did not ask for my side of the story or offer any pleasantries. He declared that Audrey had drawn a hard line in the sand. He pointed to the heavy folder and stated it was a legally binding cease and desist order. He informed me that any attempt to contact her husband or the local press would result in my immediate legal destruction. He leaned in close to my face, close enough for me to smell his expensive mint cologne. He smiled with a predator's absolute confidence. He promised that if I uttered a single word to a reporter, Audrey's legal team would file an emergency medical injunction. They would fabricate a detailed medical history proving I suffered from severe senile dementia. They would have me permanently institutionalized in a state psychiatric ward before the evening news even aired. He thought I was just an uneducated, grieving old man from the wrong side of the tracks. He assumed his expensive suit and aggressive intimidation tactics would terrify me into absolute submission. He fully expected me to tremble, lower my head, and obey. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to his physical intimidation. I calmly reached into my worn jacket pocket and pulled out my reading glasses. I picked up the heavy document from the mattress. I flipped past the aggressive cover letter and went straight to the binding clauses. For 30 years, I sat in sterile government offices tearing apart the most sophisticated insurance fraud schemes in the entire country. I spent decades hunting down phantom corporations and prosecuting wealthy men who thought their money made them untouchable. My eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs with mechanical precision. I recognized the boilerplate intimidation tactics instantly. I also recognized a massive structural flaw in the paperwork. The lawyer had rushed the injunction to silence me quickly. He had filed the protective order under the umbrella of the primary holding corporation registered to Audrey's family. He failed to account for the strict interstate commerce regulations governing that specific financial entity. The document cited a local jurisdiction for a corporation entirely shielded by federal tax loopholes. The legal threat was completely hollow. It was a cheap scare tactic designed to paralyze an uninformed civilian. I explained to him that the holding corporation listed on page 4 was identical to a ghost entity I had personally audited 2 decades ago. I informed him that utilizing a defunct shell company to file a local intimidation order constituted a direct violation of federal racketeering statutes. I took the heavy stack of expensive legal paper in both hands. I gripped the binding tightly and ripped the entire document straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper echoed sharply in the small room. I tossed the torn halves directly onto the lawyer's expensive Italian leather shoes. I stood up from the bed and forced him to look me in the eye. I told him he had just handed me written confirmation of corporate malfeasance. I advised him to stop issuing empty threats and start preparing his clients for a massive federal subpoena. The arrogant smirk vanished from the lawyer's face entirely. He realized he was not dealing with a confused father. He realized he had just handed a loaded weapon to a veteran fraud investigator. The corporate attorney took a slow step backward toward the shattered doorframe. He did not attempt to argue the legal technicality. He understood he had made a fatal miscalculation. Audrey had not hired him to engage in a fair legal debate. She had hired him to eliminate a problem by any means necessary. The lawyer reached up and forcefully grabbed his own collar. He ripped his silk tie straight down the middle. He grabbed the edge of his expensive lapel and tore the fabric with violent force. He shoved a nearby floor lamp, sending it crashing into the motel window. The glass shattered outward, raining sharp shards down into the parking lot below. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket and dialed emergency services. He did not speak with the commanding, arrogant tone of a wealthy attorney. He forced his voice to shake with manufactured terror. He told the emergency dispatcher that he had been violently ambushed by a mentally unstable senior citizen. He claimed I was heavily armed and actively making death threats against the executive board of Vanguard Estates. He pleaded for immediate assistance, stating his life was in imminent, unavoidable danger. He ended the call and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. He smiled as he adjusted his ruined jacket. He informed me that Audrey did not need a valid cease and desist order to bury me. She just needed a plausible excuse to put me in a cage. He backed out into the hallway and signaled his heavy security detail to completely block the only exit. I did not have time to grab my belongings or plan an escape route. The wail of police sirens pierced the afternoon air within 90 seconds. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the cheap floral wallpaper of my rented room. 2 police cruisers skidded to a violent halt in the parking lot right outside my shattered window. 4 officers drew their weapons and sprinted toward my door. They shouted aggressive commands, ordering me to drop into the floor with my hands behind my head. Audrey had not just threatened my freedom with fraudulent paperwork. She had weaponized the entire city police force to silence me forever. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists. I did not resist the officers. Struggling against an adrenaline-fueled police force is a guaranteed death sentence for a man of my age and complexion. They transported me directly to the county psychiatric hospital under a mandatory 72-hour evaluation hold. Audrey had calculated this maneuver flawlessly. She knew the legal system favored the wealthy, and her attorney had filed the emergency injunction claiming I was an active danger to myself and others. I was placed in a sterile white examination room. The heavy security door locked behind me with a resounding click. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor. I knew the exact protocol of a psychiatric hold. The first 24 hours are designed to break a patient's spirit. They isolate you, strip away your personal belongings, and heavily monitor your reactions. Audrey anticipated that I would scream, fight the order, and demand my release. An emotional outburst would immediately validate the corporate lawyer's fabricated police report. I refused to give them that satisfaction. A young attending psychiatrist walked into the room carrying a thick medical file. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply sat across from me and stared with clinical detachment. He opened the file provided by Audrey's attorney. He stated that I was suffering from severe untreated delusions regarding a son who had tragically drowned 2 decades ago. He noted my sudden appearance at a corporate headquarters and my aggressive confrontation with a highly respected billionaire. He intended to build an airtight medical case to permanently transfer my guardianship to the state. He began his hostile interrogation by asking me to identify the current year and the president. He spoke slowly, enunciating every syllable as if I were a confused toddler. He held a pen over a diagnostic checklist, fully prepared to mark me down as a broken mind. He wanted me to detail the drowning of my son so he could weaponize my grief. I sat perfectly upright in my molded plastic chair. I did not blink. I stared directly into the center of his pupils. I let the silence stretch between us until his manufactured confidence began to fracture. I was not a victim waiting for a diagnosis. I was an investigator analyzing a hostile witness. I leaned forward and placed my hands flat on the stainless steel table. I did not speak about 1994. I recited the precise legal statutes governing involuntary medical confinement in our state. I quoted the specific federal mandates regarding medical malpractice and the severe penalties for falsifying a psychiatric evaluation based entirely on third-party corporate hearsay. I watched the color slowly drain from the young doctor's face. I informed him that the legal document he was using as his primary diagnostic tool was drafted by a holding company actively under federal scrutiny. I challenged his professional ethics. I asked him if he truly wanted to risk his medical license to facilitate a fraudulent corporate silencing tactic. I detailed my 30-year career investigating sophisticated insurance fraud networks. I explained the exact methodology I used to dismantle corrupt medical professionals who accepted bribes to sign fraudulent injury reports. The doctor stopped tapping his pen. He closed the thick medical file. He realized instantly that he was not interrogating a senile, grieving senior citizen. He understood he was sitting across from a highly educated tactical investigator who was actively building a federal case against his employers. The sterile room grew suffocatingly quiet. He looked at the shattered doorframe of my fabricated diagnosis. He knew keeping me against my will after this demonstration of total cognitive clarity constituted illegal imprisonment. He stood up from his chair. He did not ask me another insulting question. He walked directly to the heavy security door and called for the attending nurse. He demanded the immediate preparation of my discharge papers. He signed the release authorization with a trembling hand. Audrey's meticulously planned medical trap collapsed completely in under 20 minutes. I retrieved my personal belongings from the security desk. I carefully checked the inventory list, ensuring nothing had been tampered with or removed by Audrey's lingering influence. I walked through the double doors of the psychiatric ward and stepped into the cool evening air. I had survived the first direct assault, but the war was escalating rapidly. I could not fight a billion-dollar empire using defensive maneuvers alone. I needed to go on the offensive immediately. Audrey possessed unlimited financial resources and absolutely zero moral boundaries. She was willing to utilize the police and the medical establishment to bury me alive. I had to pivot my strategy before she launched her next strike. I walked 3 blocks away from the hospital before stopping under the flickering light of a street lamp. I needed a secure location to regroup and plan my next move. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my burner phone. I had purchased the untraceable device hours before visiting the Vanguard Estates headquarters, knowing my primary phone would inevitably be compromised. The cheap plastic device vibrated aggressively in my palm. The screen illuminated the dark sidewalk. I received a heavily encrypted text message from a completely unknown number. I did not have any contacts saved on this phone. No one in the world possessed this specific number. I opened the message with absolute caution. The text consisted of 2 chilling sentences. It read, "You stirred the water. Vanguard just wired $2 million offshore to erase the 1994 paper trail." I stared at the glowing text. The implications struck me with the force of a physical blow. Someone inside Audrey's impenetrable corporate fortress was watching her every financial move. Someone possessed high-level clearance to monitor offshore wire transfers in real time. More importantly, this anonymous informant knew exactly who I was and what I was searching for. $2 million was not a random corporate transaction. It was a massive, desperate bribe designed to silence whoever held the original forensic records of my son's fake death. Audrey and Pierce were actively destroying the evidence. I realized my confrontation in the parking garage had triggered a massive panic within their syndicate. They were burning the paper trail before I could dig it up. I kicked a piece of gravel into the street. Leaving no digital footprint was the first rule of survival in this game. I crushed the burner phone under the heavy heel of my boot and kicked the shattered pieces into a storm drain. I had to intercept that money trail. I needed to find the original documents before the offshore bribe reached its destination. I could not do this alone. I needed access to sealed municipal archives and federal databases. The game had shifted entirely. I needed to resurrect a ghost from my own past. I flagged down a passing taxi and climbed into the back seat. I watched the city lights blur past the window, calculating my next move. I needed the one man who owed me his life. I watched the taillights of the cab vanish into the pre-dawn mist. The burner phone was gone, crushed beneath my boot. Vanguard's $2 million wire transfer meant they were moving faster than I anticipated. They were actively erasing the structural foundation of their empire before I could expose it. Audrey had weaponized the police and psychiatric systems against me in under 48 hours. I could not dismantle a corrupted billion-dollar conglomerate using only public records and righteous anger. I required access to sealed grand jury indictments and locked federal databases. I needed the single man in the state who owed me a debt he could never repay. I hailed another taxi and directed the driver to a gated community in the western suburbs. I arrived at the sprawling brick estate just as the sun crested the horizon. I walked past the manicured hedges and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. Arthur Hayes opened the door wearing a silk robe and a look of profound exhaustion. 30 years ago, Hayes was a junior prosecutor drowning in unsolved insurance fraud cases. I had handed him the meticulously documented evidence that dismantled 3 major crime syndicates, effectively building his entire career. He had retired as the most decorated state prosecutor in the district. I stepped into his foyer without waiting for an invitation. I informed him that I needed an immediate favor. Hayes led me into his mahogany-paneled study and poured 2 cups of black coffee. He listened in absolute silence as I detailed the confrontation in the parking garage, the fraudulent psychiatric hold, and the encrypted message about the offshore wire transfer. He did not question my sanity. He knew my investigative instincts were flawless. He set his coffee cup down and shook his head. He stated that Vanguard Estates was not a standard corporate entity. He explained that Audrey's family possessed deep political connections, funding mayoral campaigns and judicial elections across the state. He warned me that investigating them directly was a guaranteed suicide mission. He refused to jeopardize his hard-earned retirement to fight an unwinnable war. He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. I remained seated in the leather armchair. I did not attempt to appeal to his sense of justice or his loyalty. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a faded manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of his pristine desk. I told him to review the documents before he decided to walk away. Hayes opened the folder reluctantly. He stared at the yellowed paperwork from 1994. The documents detailed the massive life insurance payout authorized after the supposed drowning of my son. He looked up confused, asking why a standard death benefit mattered now. I pointed to the specific signature authorizing the immediate release of the funds. The signature belonged to a senior executive at a regional commercial bank. That executive was Audrey's father. I explained the anomaly. In 1994, it was virtually impossible to expedite a massive life insurance payout without a physical body or a prolonged legal waiting period. The process typically took years of agonizing litigation, yet my late wife received the funds in under 3 weeks. The payout had bypassed every standard regulatory protocol. I leaned forward and delivered the killing blow. I informed Hayes that the exact amount of the expedited insurance payout perfectly matched the initial seed capital used to launch Vanguard Estates 20 years ago. My son's staged death was not a tragedy. It was the fraudulent financial foundation of a criminal empire. The color drained from Hayes's face. He understood the legal implications instantly. The statute of limitations on standard insurance fraud had long expired, but the active concealment of a massive financial crime involving corporate executives and federal banking channels constituted an ongoing RICO violation. He realized that Vanguard Estates was a fragile house of cards built on a stolen identity. The political connections he feared were completely irrelevant if we could prove the entire corporation was legally invalid. Hayes slowly sat back down in his chair. The retired prosecutor vanished. The aggressive attorney I had known 30 years ago re-emerged. He pulled a secured, encrypted laptop from his desk drawer. He typed in a series of complex bypass codes accessing a restricted municipal archive reserved exclusively for high-level legal inquiries. He navigated past layers of digital security to locate the specific medical examiner files from 1994. He pulled up the original autopsy report from the river drowning. The file contained the dental records used to positively identify the recovered body as my son. Hayes cross-referenced the archive with a secondary federal database comparing the dental patterns with an unsolved missing persons report filed in the same county 2 days prior to the drowning. The match was instantaneous and undeniable. The dental records did not belong to my son. They belonged to a 24-year-old homeless man whose disappearance had never been thoroughly investigated. The digital fingerprints proved that the medical examiner had deliberately swapped the files to facilitate a false identification. My son had not merely faked his own death to escape his debts, he had actively utilized the corpse of a murdered man to execute the insurance fraud. The silence in the study was absolute. Hayes stared at the glowing screen. He turned to me with a grim, calculating expression. He stated that the holding company had not just committed financial fraud, they were actively covering up a homicide. He closed the laptop with a sharp snap. He informed me that the statute of limitations on murder never expires. The corporate giants were no longer fighting a defamation case. They were facing life in federal prison. We now possessed the lethal leverage required to tear down the entire empire. The revelation of the swapped dental records required immediate, irrefutable financial evidence to connect the murder to the current corporate empire. I could not rely on subpoenas that Audrey's legal team would tie up in appellate courts for years. I needed direct access to the Vanguard Estates private server. The corporation was hosting its annual philanthropic gala at the grandest luxury hotel in the financial district. The building was heavily fortified by private armed security. They guarded the front entrances, the VIP elevators, and the ballroom doors. They completely ignored the service personnel. I leveraged this fundamental blind spot. I acquired a gray industrial uniform from a commercial cleaning supply vendor. I equipped myself with a heavy rolling trash bin and a standard utility belt. Hayes utilized a contact within the municipal building inspector's office to clone a master magnetic key card. I parked my unmarked sedan in the dark alleyway behind the hotel kitchen. I walked directly into the chaotic service corridor. Dozens of caterers and event staff rushed past me carrying trays of expensive champagne. I did not lower my head. I walked with the slow, invisible posture of a man who had worked manual labor for 10 hours. The private security guard standing near the restricted elevators glanced at me for a fraction of a second before looking away. Wealthy men train their guards to look for threats in expensive suits. They do not perceive a 69-year-old African-American janitor as a tactical danger. I swiped the cloned keycard against the electronic reader. The light blinked green. The heavy metal doors slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the penthouse suite. The corporate entity had rented the entire top floor for private negotiations. The elevator chimed softly. The hallway was lined with thick carpeting and silent closed doors. I located the primary office designated for the chief executive officer. I checked the perimeter to ensure no cameras were actively monitoring this specific blind spot. I opened the door using the master key card. I locked the heavy mahogany door behind me and abandoned the trash bin. I approached the massive glass desk in the center of the room. Pierce had left his primary laptop resting on the desk, connected directly to the secure internal network. The machine was locked behind biometric security protocols. I reached into my utility belt and pulled out a specialized decryption drive provided by my former colleagues in the fraud division. I inserted the metal decryption drive directly into the primary port of the laptop. The illuminated screen immediately went black. Lines of automated bypass code began executing across the monitor in rapid succession. I spent 30 years analyzing the digital footprints of corrupt medical providers and offshore banking syndicates. I knew exactly how to extract hidden ledgers from heavily encrypted networks. A green progress bar appeared on the screen indicating the active cloning of the master trust fund records. The transfer speed was agonizingly slow. I watched the percentage climb. 40%, 60%, 80%. The heavy mechanical lock on the mahogany door suddenly clicked open. The security system recognized an authorized biometric entry. Audrey stepped into the executive office. She wore a floor-length crimson gown and a diamond necklace that cost more than a suburban house. She held a crystal champagne flute in her right hand. Her confident smile vanished the absolute second she registered my presence behind the desk. She recognized my face instantly. She saw the gray uniform. She saw the glowing laptop screen executing the unauthorized data transfer. She did not hesitate or ask a single question. She realized immediately that I was extracting the financial blueprints of her entire empire. Audrey lunged across the room with shocking speed. She raised her hand and slapped me across the jaw with maximum force. The heavy diamond ring on her finger tore through the skin of my cheek. The sharp physical pain radiated down my neck. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I did not strike her back. I did not break my composure. I reached forward and gripped the laptop screen to steady myself. Audrey opened her mouth and let out a piercing, calculated scream. She yelled for her private security detail to breach the room and arrest the corporate spy. The progress bar on the monitor hit 100%. The system chimed softly, confirming the data extraction was complete. I ripped the decryption drive from the port and shoved it deep into the reinforced pocket of my jumpsuit. Frantic footsteps echoed loudly in the carpeted hallway outside. Multiple security guards were sprinting toward the office. Audrey blocked my path to the main door, her eyes blazing with absolute murderous rage. The physical assault was a desperate attempt to stall me. I wiped the warm blood from my cheek. I had the evidence. I needed an immediate exit strategy. A massive security guard wearing a tactical earpiece burst through the doorway. He reached for the heavy baton clipped to his belt. I did not engage him in a physical struggle. I grabbed the handles of the heavy rolling trash bin I had brought into the room. I shoved the industrial cart violently forward. The hard plastic wheels caught the edge of the thick carpet. The heavy bin crashed directly into the guard's knees. He collapsed forward with a sharp grunt of pain, temporarily blocking the entrance. I turned away from Audrey and sprinted toward the adjoining private executive bathroom. I locked the secondary door behind me. I knew the architectural layout of these luxury suites always included a discreet exit route for high-profile clients to avoid the press. I kicked open the maintenance access panel leading to the rear service corridor. I slipped through the narrow gap just as the security team began battering the bathroom door. I sprinted down the concrete stairwell. I caught the lower-level freight elevator precisely as the metal doors began to slide shut. The descent to the basement was agonizingly slow. I stripped off the gray jumpsuit in the dark alleyway, leaving it discarded behind a dumpster. I walked rapidly to my parked sedan. I locked the doors and started the engine. I did not drive away immediately. I pulled my portable terminal from the glove compartment. I plugged the decryption drive into the screen. The encrypted financial ledgers illuminated the dark interior of my car. I scrolled through the master ownership documents of Vanguard Estates. The truth of the corporate structure hit me like a physical blow. Pierce Waverly did not own a single share of voting stock. He possessed no equity, no executive authority, and no actual financial control. The entire holding company was an elaborate, heavily fortified shield for a family trust fully controlled by Audrey. My son was not a billionaire mastermind orchestrating a corporate empire. My son was a highly paid puppet. He was a disposable legal liability positioned specifically to take the fall for a massive criminal syndicate. If the federal government ever investigated the fraudulent insurance money, Pierce would face the absolute entirety of the criminal charges. Audrey had bought him, married him, and trapped him in a golden cage. The war had just escalated beyond a fake death. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the alley. I navigated the dark city streets, putting miles between my sedan and the Vanguard Estates gala. The adrenaline from the extraction began to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing exhaustion. I parked near a neon-lit 24-hour diner on the industrial edge of the city. I needed strong black coffee and a quiet, isolated booth to process the massive implications of the cloned financial ledgers. The sun was just beginning to break over the concrete horizon, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. I ordered a simple breakfast and sat in the corner, my mind racing through the tactical realities of my son's golden cage. When the tired waitress brought the check, I handed her my standard debit card. She returned 90 seconds later, looking apologetic, and stated the card had been declined. I knew my account held a healthy operational balance. I handed her a backup credit card. She swiped it through the machine and shook her head. Declined. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and used a newly acquired burner phone to access my banking portal. Bold red text illuminated the small screen. My state pension, my primary checking account, and my personal emergency savings were entirely locked. The screen displayed a harsh administrative fraud investigation hold. Audrey had not wasted a single hour after slapping me in that penthouse office. She had immediately weaponized her father's extensive commercial banking connections to unilaterally sever my financial lifeline. She wanted to terrify me. She wanted me destitute, unable to hire legal counsel, unable to fuel my car, and unable to secure a safe place to sleep. She intended to starve me into absolute submission, forcing the broken old man to crawl back to her ivory tower begging for mercy. She fundamentally misunderstood the resilience of a man who had survived the grittiest fraud investigations of the 1980s. Panic is a useless luxury reserved for the unprepared. I felt a cold, familiar calm settle over my mind. I walked back into the diner, placed a crisp $50 bill from my money clip on the counter, and left a generous tip. I kept minor cash for minor emergencies, but minor cash would not fund a war against $1 billion syndicate. I climbed back into my vehicle. Audrey believed she controlled the entire financial board. She had no idea how many hidden pieces I still had in play. I drove straight into the heart of the financial district, deliberately bypassing the towering commercial banks that Audrey's family effectively owned and operated. I parked 3 blocks away from an unassuming, unmarked limestone building tucked discreetly between two high-end tailors. This was a private wealth management firm catering exclusively to clients who required absolute, impenetrable discretion. 35 years ago, during the absolute height of my undercover career, dismantling violent cartel insurance frauds, the federal government had established a secure offshore contingency fund for my personal operational protection. When the dangerous operations concluded, I had quietly maintained the account, transferring the balance into a decentralized blind trust entirely disconnected from my public Social Security number. It was a ghost fund existing in the shadows, completely invisible to Audrey's corporate banking spies and algorithmic sweeps. I walked through the heavy brass doors and presented a physical bearer bond, along with a biometric thumbprint, to the senior vault manager. I did not speak a single word. The transaction was conducted in complete professional silence. I was escorted into a private subterranean viewing room lined with reinforced steel. The manager returned 10 minutes later carrying a heavy reinforced leather duffel bag. I signed a single paper ledger officially liquidating the entire ghost account and handed the pen back to the manager. I unzipped the heavy leather bag to inspect the contents. Inside sat exactly $200,000 in crisp, untraceable, non-sequential $100 bills. This was not vulnerable electronic money subject to corporate freezing orders or corrupt judicial injunctions. This was pure, tangible, undeniable leverage. I zipped the bag shut and slung the heavy strap over my shoulder. The physical weight of the currency felt deeply reassuring against my side. Audrey thought she had brilliantly severed my supply lines and left me to wither on the street. Instead, her aggressive retaliation had forced me to unlock a tactical war chest she could never trace or freeze. I walked out of the private bank and blended seamlessly back into the busy morning foot traffic. I now possessed the untraceable capital required to completely bypass traditional legal channels. I was going to strike Vanguard Estates where they were most vulnerable. I would not waste time hiring expensive defense lawyers. I was going to buy the very walls protecting my son. I did not return to my cheap motel. I drove my sedan directly to an aging industrial park located on the gritty southern fringe of the city. I pulled up to a low-slung, windowless concrete building surrounded by high chain-link fences and razor wire. This was the fortified operational headquarters of Ironclad Security Solutions. Ironclad was the elite private military contractor Vanguard Estates utilized exclusively to guard their glass towers, their high-profile galas, and Audrey's sprawling personal estate. While reviewing the decrypted financial ledgers the night before, my trained eyes had noticed a glaring weakness in Ironclad's operational structure. The aggressive security firm was dangerously over-leveraged, struggling to survive under the crushing weight of predatory corporate loans. Vanguard Estates kept the heavily armed contractors totally compliant by holding their crippling debt directly over their heads. I grabbed the heavy leather duffel bag from the passenger seat and walked straight into the gritty main office. I bypassed the stunned receptionist and walked directly into the owner's glass-walled office without knocking. The owner, a heavily scarred former military contractor, stood up aggressively to demand an explanation for the sudden intrusion. I did not offer any polite pleasantries. I dropped the heavy leather bag directly onto the center of his cluttered metal desk. I unzipped the top, revealing the dense banded stacks of $100 bills. I informed the owner that I held exactly $200,000 in untraceable cash. I offered to completely buy out the high-interest debt currently crippling his security firm, effectively transferring the ultimate leverage from Vanguard Estates directly to myself. The owner stared at the mountain of cash, his jaw visibly clenched in absolute disbelief. I laid out the strict new terms of our engagement. I did not want his highly trained security teams to abandon their lucrative posts. I wanted them to stand down completely and look the other way when I walked through the heavily guarded front doors of Audrey's private residential estate. I was purchasing complete, uncontested access to the fortress currently holding my son. The owner looked from the untraceable cash to my cold, unwavering eyes. He slowly reached out and pulled the heavy bag across the metal desk. The tactical transaction was sealed. I walked out of the office knowing Audrey's impenetrable defensive perimeter had just been entirely dismantled from the inside out. She was completely unprotected. I parked my sedan in the shadow of a rusted billboard across the street from the Starlight Motor Inn. I had rented room 114 4 hours earlier under a fictitious name. I did not intend to sleep there. I intended to use it as a spider web. My 30 years of hunting corporate predators taught me that cornered animals always strike out blindly. Audrey knew I possessed the decrypted financial ledgers proving her empire was a house of cards. She knew I had successfully neutralized her private security perimeter. Her only remaining tactical option was the total physical destruction of my evidence. At exactly 2 a.m, a matte black utility van idled into the motel parking lot. 3 men stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. They wore dark tactical clothing and carried heavy canvas bags. They did not bother to pick the lock. The largest of the 3 produced a specialized hydraulic breaching tool. He snapped it against the doorframe, and the heavy metal lock gave way with a muffled, violent crack. I watched them enter the dark room. I had placed a small wireless surveillance camera on top of the television console, broadcasting directly to the tablet resting on my steering wheel. The feed illuminated the men in green night vision. They operated with terrifying mechanical efficiency. They were not searching for loose cash or valuables. They were conducting a systematic purge. One man began slicing open the cheap mattress and tearing apart the box spring. Another utilized a high-powered magnetic sweeper across the floorboards to detect hidden digital storage drives. The team leader focused entirely on the desk I had deliberately staged. He grabbed the decoy laptop I had purchased at a local pawn shop. He slammed a heavy steel hammer down on the center of the keyboard, shattering the screen and pulverizing the internal motherboard. He scooped up the scattered dummy files and shoved them into a portable industrial shredder they had brought into the room. They were meticulously erasing every digital and physical footprint of my existence. They wanted to ensure I possessed absolutely nothing when I finally went to the authorities. They spent exactly 12 minutes tearing the room down to the studs. They moved like ghosts, convinced they had successfully neutralized a major threat to Vanguard Estates. I sat in the cold silence of my car and watched the 3 men carry their canvas bags back to the waiting utility van. The team leader held up a thick, heavy external hard drive. It was the centerpiece of my staged desk. I saw him nod to his accomplices with clear satisfaction before tossing the drive into the passenger seat. He believed he had just confiscated the master copy of the Vanguard Trust Fund ledgers. He believed he was delivering my absolute destruction directly to his employer. He was entirely incorrect. He was carrying a Trojan horse right into the heart of their criminal operation. During my tenure as a senior fraud investigator in the 1980s, I learned that you never fight a heavily armed syndicate on their own battlefield. You invite them onto yours. The external hard drive they stole did not contain a single byte of financial data. I had gutted the internal memory platters and replaced them with a military-grade active GPS tracking beacon. The device was wired to a high-capacity lithium battery and programmed to ping its exact coordinates to my encrypted terminal every 30 seconds. I started my engine as the black van pulled out of the motel parking lot. I did not turn on my headlights. I did not follow them closely. I did not need to risk a high-speed pursuit through the deserted city streets. I let them drive away into the darkness, completely unaware that they were broadcasting their escape route directly to the man they had been hired to eliminate. I glanced down at the glowing map on my tablet. A pulsing red dot moved steadily northward along the interstate highway. I put the car in gear and merged onto the deserted road, maintaining a comfortable 3-mile distance. My mind processed the upcoming tactical scenario. Audrey would demand immediate visual confirmation of the destroyed evidence. She would want the stolen hard drive delivered directly to her primary command center. I expected the red dot to lead me straight back to the shimmering glass tower of Vanguard Estates, or to Audrey's sprawling private mansion. I anticipated a final confrontation with her remaining loyalists. I mentally prepared myself to breach a heavily guarded corporate fortress. I drove in total silence for 45 minutes, letting the glowing red dot guide me through the dark, winding roads of the metropolitan outskirts. The tracking beacon deviated wildly from the expected route. It did not take the highway exit leading toward the financial district. It bypassed the affluent suburban developments where Vanguard executives maintained their sprawling properties. Instead, the signal moved steadily toward an isolated, heavily wooded enclave known for housing the city's old money and elite political figures. The red dot finally stopped moving. It settled on a specific coordinate at the end of a private, dead-end cul-de-sac. I pulled my sedan over half a mile away, parking under the dense canopy of ancient oak trees. I retrieved my tactical binoculars and walked silently along the edge of the manicured tree line. The damp grass muffled my footsteps. I approached the coordinates and crouched behind a low stone wall. The black utility van was parked in the circular driveway of a massive colonial-style brick mansion. The property was surrounded by tall, wrought iron gates and discreet security cameras. This was not a Vanguard corporate safe house. I pulled up the public property records on my secured terminal and cross-referenced the address. The result chilled the blood in my veins. The estate did not belong to a corporate lawyer or an offshore banking executive. It belonged to the Honorable Marcus Sterling, a sitting judge on the federal appellate court. The pieces of the conspiracy slammed together with terrifying clarity. Audrey was not simply utilizing aggressive corporate attorneys to silence me. She was actively purchasing the federal judicial system. She had directed her hired cleaners to deliver the stolen evidence directly to a federal judge. He was the ultimate firewall protecting my son's stolen identity. If I had walked into a police station or an FBI field office with the decrypted financial ledgers, Judge Sterling would have intercepted the indictment, sealed the evidence, and buried the case permanently. Audrey was buying absolute federal protection to ensure the murder of that homeless man in 1994 remained a buried ghost story. The billionaire syndicate had fortified their empire with the highest level of government corruption. I lowered my binoculars and stared at the quiet mansion. They had the police force. They had the psychiatric hospitals. They had the federal courts. I had to tear down the entire judicial pillar before I could reach my son. I needed a witness who could not be shielded by judicial corruption. The federal judge was a brick wall, but every wall has a structural weakness at its base. Arthur Hayes and I spent the night digging through the original 1994 financial filings. We identified the insurance broker who personally signed off on the expedited $2 million death benefit. His name was Richard Vance. He had retired early and spent his days living in opulent comfort at an exclusive, heavily guarded country club on the wealthy north side of the city. We did not wait for a subpoena that Audrey's federal judge would immediately quash. We drove directly to the sprawling golf course at dawn. We bypassed the front security gate by parking my sedan near the service entrance and walking through the dense tree line bordering the 18th hole. The morning air was crisp and smelled of freshly cut grass and expensive cigars. I spotted Vance standing near a sand trap. He wore a pristine white polo shirt and pressed khaki trousers. He was lining up a putt, laughing with two other wealthy retirees. He looked like a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. Hayes and I stepped out from the shadow of the tall oak trees and walked across the manicured green directly toward him. Vance looked up. He did not recognize my face, but he instantly recognized Hayes. The retired state prosecutor possessed a reputation that terrified corrupt financial operatives. The arrogant smile vanished from Vance's face. He dropped his expensive putter onto the grass. He did not excuse himself to his playing partners. He turned and sprinted toward his motorized golf cart idling on the paved path. He was a coward running on pure instinct. I anticipated his exact escape route. I broke into a heavy sprint, cutting across the steep incline of the putting green. I reached the paved path just as Vance threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed his foot onto the accelerator. I did not attempt to negotiate. I grabbed the heavy steering wheel of the moving cart and violently yanked it to the left. The front tires caught the raised concrete curb. The cart spun out of control and crashed directly into the trunk of a massive pine tree. Vance slammed into the dashboard with a sharp gasp of pain. I stepped up to the wrecked cart, reached inside, and pulled the keys from the ignition. He was trapped. Vance clutched his bruised shoulder and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He demanded to know what we wanted, threatening to call the club security and have us arrested for assault. I did not raise my voice or react to his empty threats. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick forensic folder Hayes had compiled from the municipal archives. I dropped the heavy file directly onto his lap. I told him to look at the dental records. I informed him that the teeth of the man pulled from the river in 1994 belonged to a murdered homeless vagrant, not my son. I explained that the statute of limitations on corporate fraud had expired, but the penalty for facilitating a homicide carried a mandatory life sentence. The remaining color drained completely from Vance's face. He looked at the forensic photographs of the swapped dental records and began to hyperventilate. The confident millionaire vanished, replaced by a broken, terrified accomplice. He realized his expensive country club membership could not protect him from a federal murder indictment. He raised his trembling hands in immediate surrender. He begged us not to go to the authorities. He confessed everything right there on the crushed grass. He admitted that the entire drowning was a meticulously staged financial illusion. In the early 90s, my son Jordan had accumulated massive, inescapable gambling debts with incredibly dangerous underground syndicates. He was a dead man walking. Audrey's father, a ruthless banking magnate, needed a clean, unblemished face to serve as the chief executive of his newly formed corporate shield, Vanguard Estates. He saw Jordan's desperation as the perfect opportunity. Audrey's father paid off the violent bookies. He orchestrated the fake drowning using a discarded body from the city morgue. He commanded Vance to expedite the $2 million life insurance payout to legally seed the Vanguard accounts. In exchange for his life, Jordan surrendered his entire identity. He was reborn as Pierce Waverly, entirely owned and controlled by Audrey's family. Vance confessed that my son was nothing more than a highly compensated prisoner, a clean face hiding a mountain of dirty money. Hayes stood over the trembling broker and delivered a harsh ultimatum. He demanded that Vance officially turn state's evidence and testify against Audrey's family in a federal court outside of their corrupt local jurisdiction. In exchange, Hayes promised to leverage his remaining political capital to secure Vance full immunity from the homicide charges. Vance nodded frantically. He agreed to the terms without a second of hesitation. He told us he possessed the original unaltered insurance ledgers locked inside a hidden wall safe at his private residence. He swore those documents contained the direct signatures of Audrey's father authorizing the fraudulent payout. We instructed Vance to go straight home, retrieve the ledgers, and meet us at a secure, undisclosed location in exactly 3 hours. We watched him limp away toward the clubhouse entirely broken. I climbed back into my sedan with Hayes. We had secured the definitive proof required to bypass the corrupt federal judge and tear down Vanguard Estates permanently. We drove to an abandoned industrial lot on the edge of the city to await the rendezvous. We sat in the cold car watching the clock tick down. The 3-hour mark passed in absolute silence. Vance did not show up. 30 minutes later, Hayes' encrypted phone vibrated sharply. He answered the call and listened with a grim, tightening expression. He disconnected the line and looked at me with cold, heavy eyes. The police scanner had just reported an emergency dispatch to Vance's sprawling suburban estate. His wife had returned from a morning charity event and found him dead in their detached 3-car garage. The engine of his luxury vehicle was left running behind a locked door. The initial police report classified the scene as a textbook suicide caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. It was not a suicide. Audrey's surveillance network had tracked our movements to the golf course. Her security team had intercepted Vance before he could open his hidden wall safe. The cleanup crew had silenced the only living witness to the 1994 conspiracy. Audrey was ruthlessly wiping the board clean, erasing the trail with lethal precision. The corporate fraud had officially escalated into an active, bloody war. I started the engine of my sedan. I was no longer hunting a thief. I was hunting a killer. I watched the morning news broadcast from the driver's seat of my idling sedan. The small, high-definition screen of my tactical terminal illuminated the dark interior of the car. Pierce Waverly sat on a plush white sofa in a pristine television studio. He wore a navy bespoke suit that radiated quiet authority, yet his posture was meticulously crafted to project an image of deep, unsettling vulnerability. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. The lead anchor, a woman famous for her relentless, hard-hitting journalism, leaned in with manufactured sympathy. Pierce was weaving a masterful, terrifying narrative on live television. He told a national audience of millions that his family was under active siege by a deeply unhinged extortionist. He described a delusional, violent stalker who had ambushed him in a subterranean parking garage and later violently infiltrated a private charity gala. Pierce looked directly into the camera lens with his dark, familiar eyes. His voice cracked with perfectly rehearsed emotion. He stated that I was a dangerous lunatic suffering from severe psychotic breaks, entirely fixated on the Vanguard Estates' corporate wealth. He claimed I had manufactured a twisted fantasy about a dead son to justify my aggressive, escalating extortion attempts. He did not mention the torn legal injunction, the destroyed security perimeter, or the massive offshore wire transfers. He painted himself as a terrified husband and a protective corporate leader facing an irrational, deadly threat. He begged the public to respect his family's privacy during this terrifying ordeal, subtly warning that any documents this madman produced were forged hallucinations. Audrey had clearly directed this counterattack. She was weaponizing the media to control the narrative before the police even found the insurance broker's body in his garage. She intended to completely discredit any piece of evidence I released by preemptively branding me a violent madman. I closed the laptop screen. I did not feel the urge to scream or defend my sanity to an empty car. A public shouting match against a beloved billionaire victim is a battle an impoverished old man will always lose. I needed an undeniable, irrefutable strike that bypassed his expensive public relations team entirely. I had to deliver a truth so absolute that no amount of corporate spin could suppress it. I did not call the television station or attempt to argue with hostile producers over a public hotline. I drove directly to the affluent suburban neighborhood where the lead anchor resided. I parked my unmarked vehicle 2 blocks away and navigated the quiet tree-lined streets on foot. I knew her exact schedule from my days tracking evasive corporate executives. I knew she left her heavily alarmed brownstone at precisely 6 in the evening to prepare for her primetime broadcast. I stood in the deep shadows of an ancient elm tree across from her manicured driveway. The heavy mahogany front door opened. The anchor stepped out, adjusting her designer coat and scrolling rapidly through her mobile phone. She did not notice my silent approach until I stepped directly into her path. She gasped, dropping her keys onto the pavement, and instinctively reached into her handbag for a weapon. I maintained absolute stillness. I did not make a single threatening movement. I held out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I spoke with a quiet, chilling authority that immediately stopped her frantic movements. I told her she was broadcasting the calculated lies of a ruthless murderer. I instructed her to review the contents before she went on the air to defend a criminal syndicate a second time. I dropped the envelope onto the hood of her luxury sedan, turned my back on her, and walked away without another word. The envelope did not contain complex financial ledgers or unverified audio recordings that Audrey's lawyers could easily dispute. It contained certified, notarized medical records from 1982. The documents detailed a severe childhood illness that required a highly specific blood transfusion. The records contained my son's extremely rare blood type and unique genetic markers. Alongside those yellowed pediatric files, I had included my own verified medical profile from the military. The biological match was absolute, undeniable, and scientifically irrefutable. I also included a certified copy of the 1994 death certificate, highlighting the glaring physical discrepancies in the original River autopsy report. I had handed an ambitious, truth-seeking journalist the biological blueprint of the greatest corporate fraud of the century. I knew she could not resist a story of that magnitude. It was the ultimate leverage. The anchor walked into the bustling television studio with the manila envelope clutched tightly against her chest. She was a seasoned journalist who had built her entire career on exposing powerful liars and corporate corruption. She immediately bypassed the standard production meetings, ignored her makeup team, and locked herself inside her private office. She verified the heavy medical seals. She cross-referenced the state medical board registration numbers stamped on the blood typing documents using the network's private investigative database. The biological reality staring back at her was stark and unyielding. Pierce Waverly was a fabricated ghost. The man running Vanguard Estates was sharing the exact, exceptionally rare genetic markers of the alleged violent extortionist. She immediately ordered her production team to clear the entire evening schedule. She drafted a massive, explosive segment that would feature the medical documents on national television and challenge Pierce to take a live on-air DNA test. The promotional teasers began running across the bottom of the screen, promising a shattering revelation regarding the Vanguard CEO. I sat in my car outside the massive studio building, watching the live feed on my terminal. The anchor sat in her illuminated chair, vibrating with intense journalistic energy. The cameras zoomed in on her face. The red countdown clock hit 30 seconds. She took a deep breath and looked directly at the teleprompter. Suddenly, the heavy, soundproof studio doors slammed open. The executive producer sprinted onto the polished floor, waving his hands frantically and screaming for the control room to cut the feed. The live broadcast abruptly cut to a local commercial break. The screen went entirely black. My encrypted phone vibrated violently on the dashboard. I opened the message from Hayes. The tactical alert confirmed the terrifying, limitless scale of Audrey's power. She had not intimidated the producer or threatened a massive defamation lawsuit. 10 minutes before the broadcast, Audrey's holding company had finalized a massive, aggressive, hostile takeover. They utilized their offshore capital to purchase a controlling majority stake in the parent media conglomerate. Audrey had literally bought the television network for $500 million solely to pull the plug on a single primetime broadcast. The truth was locked inside a fortress of limitless money. The war had moved beyond the streets. The television screen in my sedan remained entirely black, radiating a cold, dead glow into the dark interior of my car. I sat in absolute silence, absorbing the terrifying scale of the maneuver Audrey had just executed. She had not dispatched armed thugs to intimidate a news producer or filed a frantic injunction to halt a broadcast. She had casually authorized the expenditure of $500 million to purchase an entire national media conglomerate solely to prevent a single anchor from speaking my son's true name on live television. This was the raw, unrestrained brute force of Vanguard Estates. They did not simply fight their enemies. They bought the battlefield and burned it to the ground. I put the car in gear and drove slowly back to the gritty industrial safehouse I was utilizing as a temporary command center. I needed to regroup with Hayes and analyze our dwindling tactical options. The federal criminal courts were compromised by a bought judge. The national media was effectively silenced by a hostile corporate takeover. Audrey had successfully fortified her golden cage, trapping Pierce behind an impenetrable wall of limitless capital. The next morning, the counterattack arrived with calculated bureaucratic precision. Hayes and I were reviewing municipal blueprints when a heavy knock rattled the reinforced steel door of the safe house. I checked the perimeter surveillance feed. A lone man in a cheap suit stood on the concrete steps holding a thick stack of manila folders. He was a professional process server. I unbolted the door. He thrust the heavy documents against my chest, stated I was officially served, and walked rapidly back to his vehicle. I threw the files onto the metal table. Audrey had launched a massive $50 million civil defamation lawsuit against me and Hayes. The legal documents accused us of executing a malicious coordinated campaign of psychological terror and financial extortion against the chief executive officer of Vanguard Estates. She was aggressively shifting the war from the criminal shadows into the blinding light of civil litigation. Her strategy was ruthlessly simple. She intended to enact a legal chokehold. She knew my operational ghost fund contained exactly $200,000. She planned to bleed us dry through endless suffocating pretrial motions, mandatory depositions, and exorbitant legal defense fees. Vanguard possessed a towering army of corporate litigators who charged thousands of dollars an hour. She wanted to bankrupt me completely, forcing a legal default that would grant her a permanent court-ordered gag order. She believed she had trapped the impoverished ex-investigator in a financial war of attrition I could never possibly win. Hayes did not panic. He picked up the heavy legal filing, adjusted his reading glasses, and began scanning the dense, aggressive corporate terminology. A slow, predatory smile spread across the retired prosecutor's weathered face. Audrey was a brilliant financial architect, but she fundamentally misunderstood the unpredictable volatility of civil law. She had grown so accustomed to controlling federal judges and buying television networks that she forgot the basic underlying mechanics of a defamation lawsuit. Hayes dropped the papers onto the table and looked at me with cold, absolute certainty. He explained that in order to successfully win a defamation claim, the plaintiff must definitively prove that the defendant is intentionally spreading malicious, fabricated lies. Truth is the ultimate absolute defense. Audrey had just handed us the exact weapon we needed to tear her empire apart. She had legally invited us into a courtroom where her puppet CEO was forced to prove his own identity. Hayes immediately drove to the county courthouse and filed an aggressive, expedited motion of evidentiary discovery. He bypassed the complex financial ledgers and the stolen trust fund documents. He focused entirely on the biological reality of the man claiming to be Pierce Waverly. Hayes submitted a legally binding request demanding that the Vanguard CEO submit to an independent court-mandated DNA swab to definitively prove he was not my biological son. He argued that the entire $50 million defamation suit hinged exclusively on this single biological fact. If Pierce Waverly was indeed a fabricated identity, the defamation claim immediately collapsed. Audrey's corporate lawyers filed a frantic flurry of emergency objections, claiming the request was a traumatic invasion of their client's privacy. The presiding state civil judge, entirely disconnected from Audrey's corrupt federal appellate contacts, was deeply unimpressed by Vanguard's arrogant stonewalling. He swiftly overruled the corporate objections. He signed the court order mandating that Pierce Waverly present himself at an independent state-certified medical facility within 48 hours to provide a verified genetic sample. Audrey's offensive strike had backfired with catastrophic precision. She had legally bound her prized puppet to a biological test that would instantly expose the 1994 murder conspiracy. Audrey was completely cornered. She could not purchase the civil judge, and she absolutely could not allow Pierce's actual genetic material to enter the official judicial record. The DNA match would instantly trigger a massive federal homicide investigation, completely bypassing her bought appellate judge. She was forced to execute a desperate, high-risk operational maneuver. She had to compromise the independent medical facility before the test occurred. I spent 30 years hunting sophisticated corporate predators. I knew exactly how they reacted when their legal shields evaporated. They always resorted to raw, unmitigated bribery. The court had designated a highly secure private genetic testing laboratory in the downtown medical district to administer the swab. Hayes and I did not wait for Pierce to arrive. We breached the facility the night before the scheduled test. I utilized a cloned magnetic keycard to bypass the clinic's exterior commercial security perimeter at 2 a.m. The dark, sterile hallways smelled faintly of bleach and rubbing alcohol. I moved silently toward the primary laboratory and the clinical director's private office. I spent 20 minutes installing microscopic high-definition surveillance lenses directly into the acoustic ceiling tiles, angling the feeds to capture the main desk and the secure biological storage lockers. I wired the hidden cameras to broadcast a heavily encrypted signal directly to my tactical terminal. We exited the building completely undetected and parked my sedan in a parking garage across the street to monitor the trap. The next afternoon, a sleek black town car pulled up to the rear delivery entrance of the medical clinic. A tall, sharply dressed corporate fixer stepped out carrying a heavy aluminum briefcase. He did not go to the main reception desk. He walked directly to the clinical director's private office. I sat in the dark interior of my sedan, watching the live high-definition feed stream onto my tablet. The fixer locked the office door and placed the aluminum briefcase onto the director's desk. He snapped the latches open, revealing $250,000 in banded, unmarked currency. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a sealed, sterile medical vial containing a clean, untraceable DNA swab. He did not speak in vague corporate euphemisms. The sheer desperation of Audrey's collapsing empire forced him to be entirely explicit. He instructed the terrified medical director to accept the cash discard, the court-mandated swab collected from Pierce Waverly, and log the sterile decoy vial into the official chain of custody. The exchange was captured perfectly, the audio crisp and undeniable. Audrey had sent her operative to blatantly manipulate a court-ordered procedure. She had just committed federal witness tampering, evidence destruction, and felony obstruction of justice on camera. These were aggressive, undeniable criminal acts that could not be buried by a corrupt judge or spun by a purchased television network. I pressed a single button on my terminal, saving the encrypted video file to a secure offshore cloud server. The billionaire syndicate had finally stepped out of their golden cage and directly into a federal trap. The heavy rain lashed against the reinforced steel door of our secondary safe house. Hayes had secured this subterranean concrete bunker through an old informant specifically to evade Audrey's aggressive counter-surveillance grid. At exactly 3 a.m, the perimeter proximity alarms flashed a silent red warning across my terminal. I drew my sidearm and stepped into the narrow entry corridor. I accessed the external feed. A single soaked figure stood under the flickering amber street lamp. He wore a dark unbuttoned raincoat and gripped his hands tightly against his chest. He was completely alone. He had not brought the ruthless tactical teams or the highly paid corporate fixers. Pierce Waverly had come in person. I unbolted the heavy deadbolts and pulled the door open, keeping the barrel of my weapon angled toward the wet concrete. He stepped inside. The blinding fluorescent lights of the bunker stripped away the last remaining traces of his manufactured corporate illusion. This was not the untouchable, arrogant chief executive officer who had sat in a pristine television studio and branded me a dangerous lunatic to a national audience of millions. The bespoke navy suit was gone. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His skin possessed a sickly, translucent pallor. He looked exactly like the terrified, debt-ridden boy who had vanished into the river in 1994. He had spent 30 years hiding behind a stolen identity and a wall of billionaire money, but the sheer crushing weight of the collapsing syndicate had finally broken his engineered posture. He looked around the barren concrete room with wide, panicked eyes. He was searching for escape routes that did not exist. I secured the heavy steel door behind him and locked the deadbolts. I did not offer him a chair. I did not offer him a towel to dry his trembling hands. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the illusion to speak. He reached into the inner pocket of his soaked raincoat with frantic, jerky movements. He pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of paper and slapped it down onto the scarred metal table separating us. It was a certified cashier's check drawn from a secure offshore holding company. The amount printed across the center was exactly $5 million. He pressed his palms flat against the cold metal, leaning forward with a desperate, breathless intensity. He begged me to take the money. He pleaded with the frantic rhythm of a man negotiating his own execution. He promised the funds were clean, thoroughly untraceable, and immediately accessible. He instructed me to pack my things, walk out the back door, and disappear into the shadows forever. He claimed this was the only viable exit strategy for both of us. He stated that Audrey was preparing to unleash a wave of violence that would make the golf course broker's murder look like a minor administrative error. I did not look at the check. I kept my eyes locked directly on his. When the begging failed to elicit a single reaction from my end, the terrified boy pivoted abruptly to a desperate, ugly threat. He warned me that Audrey's operational cleaners had already mapped Arthur Hayes' movements. He described the exact route Hayes took to the municipal archives and the specific diner where he drank his morning coffee. Pierce stated that Vanguard's tactical hit squad would intercept the retired prosecutor within the next 12 hours. They would torture him, extract the location of our encrypted digital servers, and leave his body in a ditch. Pierce framed the extortion as a twisted act of mercy. He claimed he was offering me $5 million to save my only ally's life. He demanded I take the buyout to prevent a bloodbath. He was using the threat of imminent murder to force me back into silent submission. I reached forward and pressed my index finger against the edge of the certified check. I slid the heavy paper back across the scarred metal table until it touched his trembling hands. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, crushing certainty of a man who had already won the war. I informed my son that his $5 million could not purchase a time machine. I told him he was attempting to extinguish a fire that had already burned his empire to the ground. I explained that Audrey's massive host of corrupt appellate judges and purchased media conglomerates were now entirely irrelevant. Hayes and I had recognized the sheer scale of the local judicial corruption the moment the insurance broker was silenced in his garage. We had completely abandoned the compromised municipal and state legal channels. I looked directly into Pierce's panicked eyes and delivered the fatal timeline. Exactly 48 hours ago, Arthur Hayes had boarded a commercial flight to Washington. He had walked directly into the heavily fortified headquarters of the Federal Office of the Inspector General. He had personally hand-delivered the complete unredacted evidentiary files. The package included the verified 1982 pediatric blood typing records, the detailed municipal autopsy discrepancies, and the high-definition surveillance footage of Audrey's fixer bribing the medical director with $250,000 in cash. The uncorrupted federal machinery was already in motion. The sealed indictments were actively being drafted in Washington, completely out of Audrey's jurisdictional reach. Pierce stared at the rejected check. His jaw went slack. The remaining oxygen left his lungs in a sharp, jagged gasp. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable reality of his situation. Vanguard Estates could not bribe the Inspector General. They could not silence a federal task force with a hostile media takeover. The avalanche had already been triggered, and it was currently accelerating straight toward his stolen throne. The terrified boy did not attempt to negotiate further. He turned around, ripped the heavy deadbolts open, and sprinted blindly out into the freezing rain. I watched the heavy steel door slam shut behind my son. The deadbolts clicked automatically into place, locking out the freezing rain and the desperate billionaire who had just realized his absolute lack of power. I did not celebrate the victory. Pierce's panic meant Vanguard Estates was bleeding from an open wound, and wounded predators are inherently volatile. I walked back to the scarred metal table to shut down my encrypted terminal, but the screen flared with a sudden overriding security protocol. It was a localized high-level secure channel request, bypassing my standard firewalls using a highly sophisticated corporate decryption algorithm. I accepted the connection. The voice on the other end was fractured, breathless, and laced with pure terror. The caller identified himself as Jonathan Reed, the chief financial officer of Vanguard Estates. He did not attempt to negotiate or offer empty corporate bribes. He stated bluntly that the Federal Inspector General had just issued a classified system-wide freeze order on Vanguard's primary operational accounts. The avalanche had officially struck the mountain. Reed was calling me because he had discovered Audrey's immediate contingency protocol. She was not preparing to defend the company in federal court. She was systematically altering the digital architecture of the master trust fund to position Reed as the solitary architect of the entire financial fraud. She was building an impenetrable legal firewall out of his career and his life. He was the designated fall guy. Reed demanded an immediate physical meeting. He claimed to hold the definitive cryptographic keys that would completely dismantle Audrey's legal defenses, but he required absolute assurance of federal witness protection before he surrendered the ledgers. I recognized the tactical leverage he possessed. I dictated the operational parameters. I refused to meet in a hotel, a parking garage, or any elevated location Vanguard's security teams could easily isolate. I selected the lowest level of the abandoned South Street subway station. It was a subterranean labyrinth of decaying concrete blind spots and intersecting commuter tunnels that completely negated long-range sniper fire and electronic surveillance. I instructed him to leave his phone in his vehicle and arrive in exactly 2 hours. The line went dead. I disassembled my terminal, packed my tactical gear into a dense canvas bag, and left the safe house through the secondary ventilation access shaft. The endgame was accelerating faster than I had anticipated. The financial architect of Audrey's empire was ready to burn her golden cage to the ground. The South Street subway station was a cavernous echo chamber of dripping water and grinding steel. I stood in the deepest shadows of the maintenance corridor, listening to the rhythmic rumble of a distant freight train vibrating through the concrete floor. At precisely 4 a.m, Jonathan Reed descended the cracked stairs. He wore an expensive tailored overcoat, but his posture was entirely ruined. He looked frantically over his shoulder, his eyes darting toward every flickering fluorescent light bulb and darkened alcove. I stepped out of the shadows, keeping my hands empty but visible. Reed flinched instinctively, backing away before recognizing my face from the recent media broadcasts. He did not waste time with formal introductions. He reached into the deep interior pocket of his coat and pulled out 2 heavily encrypted titanium-cased flash drives. His hand shook violently as he held them out to me. I did not take them immediately. I demanded to know the exact nature of the digital cargo. Reed swallowed hard, his voice echoing off the damp tiles. He explained that Pierce Waverly's stolen identity and the 1994 insurance fraud were merely the structural foundation of the syndicate. Vanguard Estates was not a standard real estate holding company. It was a sophisticated, high-volume money laundering apparatus for an international narcotics cartel. Audrey's family used the fake executive to aggressively purchase massive tracts of empty commercial real estate. They systematically inflated construction costs, fabricated rental yields, and washed hundreds of millions of dollars of illicit cartel cash through legitimate domestic banks. Pierce was the clean, untainted face positioned specifically to absorb the legal liability if the federal government ever uncovered the money laundering pipeline. The flash drives contained the master ledgers, the unredacted offshore routing numbers, and the direct communications between Audrey and the cartel's financial liaisons. Reed confessed that Audrey's infinite pool of capital was actually blood money. This devastating revelation fundamentally changed the entire tactical landscape. We were no longer fighting a corrupt family trust. We were actively dismantling a heavily armed international criminal syndicate. I reached forward and took the cold titanium drives from his trembling fingers. I instructed him to wait on the platform. I promised that Arthur Hayes would dispatch a specialized federal tactical unit to extract him within the hour and secure his immunity deal. Reed slumped against the tiled wall, exhaling a long, jagged breath of pure relief. He believed he had finally secured his survival. I secured the titanium drives in the reinforced interior pocket of my tactical vest. I told Reed to keep his head down and wait for the federal extraction team. I turned and walked rapidly down the subterranean service corridor, charting a secondary exit route that would bypass the main street-level entrances. I needed to transmit the decrypted cartel ledgers directly to the Inspector General before Vanguard realized their chief financial officer had successfully defected. I reached the grated access door at the end of the tunnel and paused. A sudden chilling instinct forced me to stop. I turned back and looked down the long expanse of the subway platform. Reed was not waiting in the shadows as instructed. Panic had completely overridden his logical obedience. He was sprinting up the main concrete stairwell toward the surface, desperate to escape the claustrophobic underground station. I dropped my canvas bag and broke into a heavy run, shouting his name. I bounded up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I breached the surface level just as Reed pushed through the heavy glass turnstiles and stepped out onto the rain-slicked pavement. The intersection was completely deserted in the pre-dawn darkness. The traffic light hanging above the wet asphalt glowed a steady bright red. Reed stepped off the curb, pulling his coat tightly around his shoulders. A matte black SUV materialized from the dense morning fog without its headlights illuminated. It did not swerve or attempt to brake. The massive vehicle accelerated through the red light with a terrifying mechanical roar. It struck Jonathan Reed with devastating, uncompromising kinetic force. The brutal impact shattered the quiet morning. The heavy grille of the SUV threw his body violently through the air, sending him crashing onto the wet concrete 30 feet away. The black vehicle did not pause. It accelerated rapidly down the empty avenue and vanished back into the thick, freezing fog. I stood frozen at the top of the subway stairs. I did not rush out into the street to check for a pulse. I knew the tactical reality of a high-speed vehicular strike. The chief financial officer of Vanguard Estates was dead. Audrey had successfully localized the leak and permanently sealed it. She was no longer buying off judges or silencing the press. She had officially escalated the corporate conflict into open, brazen murder. I touched the heavy drives in my pocket. The war was absolute. I watched the black SUV vanish into the freezing fog, taking the life of Jonathan Reed with it. I did not linger to check for a pulse I knew was extinguished. I turned my back on the bleeding body and walked swiftly back down into the labyrinth of the subway station. I had exactly 20 minutes before the first responders and Vanguard's cleanup crews swarmed the intersection. I navigated the subterranean maintenance tunnels exiting 3 blocks east through a rusted service grate. I moved with absolute purpose. I immediately secured the encrypted titanium drives inside a 24-hour automated postal locker located in the lobby of a decaying transit hub. I locked the metal compartment, pocketed the digital receipt, and stepped back out onto the damp pavement. Red and blue lights abruptly fractured the morning darkness. 3 municipal police cruisers converged on my position, their tires screeching violently against the wet asphalt. Doors flew open. 6 officers drew their service weapons and ordered me to the ground. I did not run, resist, or raise my voice. I laced my fingers behind my head and knelt on the cold concrete. They slammed heavy steel cuffs onto my wrists with excessive force. They did not read me my rights or inform me of the charges. A senior homicide detective stepped out of an unmarked vehicle. He grabbed my shoulder, hauled me to my feet, and shoved me forcefully against the side of the cruiser. He informed me I was being booked for the brutal, premeditated murder of Vanguard Estates' chief financial officer. Audrey had not wasted a single second. While her operatives were scraping Reed off the pavement, her legal fixers were already planting a fabricated narrative. The detectives sneered, stating they had a highly credible sworn eyewitness who positively identified me at the scene. This witness claimed to have seen an elderly man in a dark trench coat physically shove Reed directly into the path of an oncoming vehicle. Audrey had orchestrated a flawless frame job. She needed a convenient scapegoat to simultaneously explain the CFO's violent death and permanently eliminate the whistleblower who currently held her financial ledgers. She believed she had trapped me in a hermetically sealed legal box. I sat in the hard plastic seat of the police cruiser as we sped toward the municipal precinct. I did not argue with the arresting officers. I did not protest my innocence or complain about the tight handcuffs. I let them believe they had successfully apprehended a desperate killer. They were operating on Audrey's corrupted timeline, but I was operating on a timeline they could not possibly comprehend. The interrogation room was a windowless concrete box designed specifically to break human resolve. The air conditioning was turned down to a freezing temperature to induce physical discomfort. I sat perfectly still in a bolted metal chair, my right wrist chained securely to a heavy steel ring embedded in the table. The senior homicide detective paced the small room aggressively, slapping a thick file folder against his open palm. He presented his fabricated case with theatrical confidence. He detailed the fake witness testimony, the supposed motive of extortion, and the inevitable life sentence awaiting me in a maximum security penitentiary. He leaned heavily over the table, invading my physical space, and offered a standard plea deal if I simply confessed to a crime of passion. I did not request a defense attorney. I did not invoke my constitutional right to remain silent. I looked directly at the glaring red light of the recording camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that instantly drained the arrogance from the detective's face. I informed him that his entire timeline was a meticulously constructed corporate fiction designed by a billionaire to hide an assassination. I instructed him to verify the exact time of the hit and run. He stated defensively that the collision occurred at precisely 4:14 in the morning. I nodded slowly. I told him to contact the federal marshals stationed at the United States courthouse located in the heart of the financial district. I provided a highly specific alphanumeric reference number. I explained that at exactly 4:14 in the morning I was standing directly beneath a high-definition FBI surveillance camera at the courthouse's secure rear entrance. I was actively submitting a sworn time-stamped whistleblower declaration regarding Vanguard Estates into a federal Dropbox. I had anticipated Audrey's violent retaliation the exact moment I secured the decrypted cartel ledgers from her defecting executive. I knew she would attempt to pin the inevitable collateral damage on her primary adversary. I had deliberately established an impenetrable federally verified alibi at the exact moment she executed her chief financial officer. The detective stopped pacing. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. He realized instantly that no municipal witness, no matter how heavily bribed, could override a time-stamped, unalterable federal surveillance feed. I instructed him to stop wasting municipal resources on Vanguard's manufactured witch hunt and make the phone call. I leaned back in the uncomfortable metal chair and waited in silence. The detective left the interrogation room without speaking another word. The heavy steel door locked behind him with a resounding echo. I sat in the freezing room for exactly 42 minutes. The silence was absolute. When the door finally opened again, the aggressive posturing had vanished entirely from the room. The senior detective walked in with a tight, humiliated expression. He did not sit down. He unclipped a small key from his tactical belt and unlocked the heavy steel cuff binding my wrist to the metal table. He informed me that the federal marshals had completely verified my location. The high-definition surveillance footage placed me exactly 3 miles away from the subway station at the precise moment Jonathan Reed was killed. My alibi was scientifically and legally impenetrable. The municipal police department had absolutely no grounds to hold me, and Audrey's planted eyewitness was now facing severe federal perjury and obstruction charges. I rubbed my bruised wrist to restore the circulation and stood up slowly. I did not demand an apology or gloat over his profound tactical error. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I slid it deliberately across the metal table. The detective frowned, picking it up cautiously. I informed him that the paper contained the partial license plate number and the exact make and model of the matte black SUV that had crushed the chief financial officer. I had memorized the details in the fraction of a second before the vehicle vanished into the thick morning fog. I watched the detective's eyes widen as he read the sequence. I told him to run the plate through his secure municipal database. I guaranteed he would find it registered to a shell company operated directly by Vanguard Estates' Director of Private Security. Audrey had grown arrogant and careless in her sheer desperation to protect her international laundering empire. She had utilized her own internal tactical assets to execute a highly public assassination. I walked toward the open door, leaving the detective staring at the paper in his trembling hands. I paused in the hallway and delivered a final chilling reality check. I told him the municipal police were no longer investigating a simple extortion case or a random tragic hit and run. They were now actively tracking a billionaire syndicate executing domestic assassinations to protect a cartel pipeline. I walked out of the precinct and stepped into the pale morning light. The corporate hunters had just become the hunted. The panoramic windows of the Vanguard Estates penthouse offered an unobstructed, commanding view of the waking city, but Audrey did not notice the pale sunrise bleeding over the skyline. She stood rigidly behind her expansive mahogany desk, clutching an encrypted cellular phone to her ear. The voice on the other end belonged to her lead defense attorney, and the information he delivered was catastrophic. The municipal police were not holding the impoverished ex-investigator in a windowless holding cell. Dominic had produced an impenetrable time-stamped federal alibi that completely obliterated her meticulously crafted frame job. The situation was deteriorating with terrifying, uncontrollable speed. The homicide detectives had officially impounded the matte black SUV used to eliminate her defecting chief financial officer. They were currently executing a high-risk armed raid on the private residence of Vanguard's Director of Security. Audrey dropped the phone onto the polished desk. The cold, mechanical certainty that had built her billionaire empire evaporated in an instant. The local police were no longer compliant pawns she could control with generous campaign donations. They were actively dismantling her physical enforcement network piece by piece. The federal government was already maneuvering in the shadows, armed with undeniable proof. She knew the cartel ledgers were fully exposed. She knew the grand illusion was dead. Audrey did not waste time mourning the collapse of her legacy or the inevitable ruin of the man pretending to be Pierce Waverly. She was a survivor forged in the ruthless fires of corporate warfare. She immediately activated her ultimate contingency protocol. She bypassed her compromised executive board and accessed the deepest, most secure layer of the Vanguard digital infrastructure. She initiated a massive system-wide liquidation of the syndicate's liquid assets. Her perfectly manicured fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, executing complex administrative commands that bypassed standard financial firewalls. She began rapidly converting hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate holdings, domestic real estate portfolios, and private family trusts into untraceable cryptocurrency. She routed the digital funds through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies, selecting bank accounts in remote jurisdictions that specifically lacked extradition treaties with the United States. She intended to drain the entire Vanguard empire dry, leaving the federal authorities with a worthless, hollow shell of a corporation. She planned to board her private jet within the hour, vanish across the Atlantic Ocean, and rebuild her wealth far beyond the reach of American law enforcement. She watched the glowing progress bars on her multiple monitors slowly creeping toward completion. She was minutes away from executing the greatest financial escape in corporate history, abandoning her fake husband to face the wrath of the federal government alone. 2 miles away, inside the secure, soundproof chambers of the federal building, Arthur Hayes stood before the imposing mahogany bench of a United States district judge. I stood silently beside the retired prosecutor, watching the uncorrupted machinery of federal law finally engage. Hayes did not rely on emotional appeals or dramatic rhetoric to make his case. He weaponized the raw, undeniable data contained within the 2 titanium flash drives I had extracted from the underground subway station. He laid out the sprawling, interconnected web of Vanguard Estates' true financial architecture. He presented the master ledgers, proving the aggressive acquisition of empty commercial real estate was a highly sophisticated front for laundering international narcotics capital. He connected the fabricated identity of Pierce Waverly directly to the cartel's blood money, demonstrating how Audrey used the ghost of my son to shield a massive criminal enterprise. He provided the exact routing numbers, the offshore corporate shell designations, and the explicit, unredacted communications authorizing the illegal transfers. This was no longer a simple defamation dispute or a localized municipal murder investigation. This was a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar federal racketeering enterprise operating aggressively on American soil. The federal judge reviewed the decrypted digital ledgers with a grim, tightening expression. The sheer volume of illicit capital moving through Vanguard's domestic accounts was staggering, painting a picture of corporate corruption that reached the highest levels of the financial sector. Hayes did not give the judge time to process the sheer magnitude of the fraud. He aggressively pushed for immediate, overwhelming tactical intervention. He formally filed a comprehensive federal injunction under the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. He argued that the syndicate's leadership was actively aware of their exposure and possessed the digital capability to liquidate billions of dollars in illicit funds across international borders within minutes. He demanded a total, immediate, systemic freeze to prevent the complete evaporation of the cartel's domestic financial infrastructure. The judge recognized the severe, imminent threat of capital flight. He did not hesitate or request further briefing. He bypassed standard procedural delays and instantly signed the emergency RICO injunction. The execution order entirely bypassed the slow, easily compromised municipal courts and transmitted directly to the Federal Reserve and every major banking institution tied to the Vanguard corporate umbrella. The federal government had just dropped a suffocating, inescapable net over Audrey's entire financial ecosystem. Audrey stared intensely at the glowing monitors illuminating her dark penthouse office. The massive offshore wire transfers were queued and ready for final authorization. The digital staging area represented her entire future, over $4 billion extracted from the collapsing Vanguard empire and poised to launch into the untraceable void of international banking. She picked up her secure dual authentication device to generate the final cryptographic key required to execute the massive transaction. She typed the complex alphanumeric sequence into the primary authorization field and firmly pressed the execution command. She anticipated the familiar green confirmation screen that would signal her absolute freedom and the successful theft of the cartel's laundered capital. She exhaled a long, steady breath, preparing to contact her pilot and order the immediate preparation of her private jet on the hidden airstrip. The heavy monitors did not flash green. The system hung in an agonizing digital freeze for 3 excruciating seconds. Suddenly, every single screen in the penthouse violently shifted to a glaring, vibrant red. Audrey blinked, leaning closer to the glass, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs in a sudden surge of pure terror. The standard Vanguard corporate interface had completely vanished. In its place, a stark uniform federal notice dominated the displays. The bold white text informed her that the accounts had been seized by the United States Department of Justice under a federal racketeering injunction. A cold, suffocating panic gripped her throat. She frantically switched to her secondary terminals, attempting to access her hidden personal trusts, her emergency offshore shell companies, and even the private collegiate funds established under different aliases. Every single access point yielded the identical red screen. The federal net had captured everything simultaneously. Her sprawling billion-dollar empire was instantly reduced to absolute zero. She could not purchase a commercial plane ticket. She could not fuel her private jet. She could not even hire a defense attorney to navigate the incoming criminal storm. The limitless power she had wielded for decades was entirely derived from her capital, and Hayes and I had just evaporated every single cent she possessed. Audrey stood alone in her dark penthouse, surrounded by glowing red monitors, realizing with absolute clarity that she was completely financially paralyzed, entirely trapped, and now owed billions of dollars to an international cartel she could no longer pay. The air in the underground municipal parking structure was thick with the smell of motor oil and damp concrete. I walked steadily toward my unmarked sedan, the heavy echoes of my footsteps completely swallowed by the low mechanical hum of the industrial ventilation fans. Audrey was financially paralyzed, stripped of her billions by the massive federal injunction. I knew an apex predator stripped of its primary defenses would instantly revert to its most primal, violent nature. She could no longer afford high-priced corporate litigators or specialized media spin doctors to suppress the truth. She was forced to rely on raw, desperate brutality to survive. I reached into my heavy coat pocket for my vehicle keys when the distinct metallic sound of a weapon slide racking echoed sharply off the surrounding concrete pillars. I froze instantly. 2 men stepped out from the deep, impenetrable shadows of a concrete support column, effectively blocking my path to the vehicle. They did not wear the bespoke suits of Vanguard's usual corporate fixers. They wore heavy tactical jackets and moved with the stiff, aggressive posture of men accustomed to inflicting severe physical trauma. The taller of the 2 raised a suppressed semi-automatic pistol, aiming it directly at the center of my chest. He closed the distance rapidly, invading my personal space to establish absolute physical dominance. He ordered me to turn around and place my hands against the concrete pillar. He stated that I was going to get into the back of their waiting transport van quietly. He informed me that we were taking a long drive to an undisclosed secondary location where I would manually authorize the complete withdrawal of the federal RICO injunction. They intended to brutally torture me until the frozen assets were released back into Audrey's control. The second attacker flanked me on the right, pulling heavy plastic zip ties from his tactical vest. They possessed the arrogant, careless confidence of men who believed they were dealing with a fragile, terrified senior citizen. They looked at my gray hair and my worn coat and saw an easy, lucrative target. They assumed Audrey had sent them to intimidate a defenseless old man. They failed to realize that before I became a forgotten ghost in a quiet suburban house, I spent 3 decades tracking the most dangerous individuals in the criminal underworld. I did not raise my hands. I maintained my calculated stillness, mentally, measuring the exact distance between the suppressed barrel and my vital organs. The leader stepped aggressively into my striking radius to apply the heavy plastic restraints. He committed the fatal tactical error of looking down at my wrists for a fraction of a second, momentarily breaking his visual line of sight. I did not hesitate or project my intentions. 30 years of buried muscle memory instantly overrode my age. I pivoted sharply to the left, slipping entirely off his center line and effectively clearing the barrel of the suppressed weapon. In the exact same fluid motion, I drove the hardened heel of my right palm upward, striking the median nerve cluster on his extended gun arm. The heavy impact generated a shockwave of temporary paralysis directly through his bicep. His fingers went completely numb. The weapon dropped toward the concrete. I trapped his wrist with my left hand, torquing his arm violently outward to hyperextend the joint, and caught the falling pistol seamlessly with my right hand in midair. I drove the heavy steel frame of the weapon directly into his jaw. The dull, sickening crunch of fracturing bone echoed loudly in the empty garage. He collapsed onto the cold floor, instantly incapacitated. The second attacker registered the sudden violent shift in the dynamic. He dropped the zip ties and lunged forward, reaching beneath his heavy jacket for a concealed combat knife. He was fast-fueled by adrenaline, but he telegraphed his movements wildly. He slashed horizontally, aiming a lethal strike directly for my throat. I stepped inside his arc, entirely bypassing his offensive momentum. I parried his knife arm outward with my left forearm, exposing the entire right side of his upper torso. I chambered my right arm and delivered a devastating, ruthless strike directly to his clavicle, using the reinforced steel butt of the captured pistol. The concentrated kinetic force shattered his collarbone upon impact. The bone snapped with a sharp, cracking sound that resembled a breaking branch. The man screamed in pure, unadulterated agony, dropping the combat knife instantly as his entire right arm went completely limp. The violent momentum of my strike sent him crashing heavily against the side of my parked sedan. He slid slowly down the metal door, clutching his ruined chest, unable to process how an elderly man had just dismantled an armed extraction team in less than 10 seconds. The skirmish was decisively over. The absolute silence returned to the subterranean garage, punctuated only by their jagged, shallow breathing. I stood perfectly still in the dim light, actively controlling my heart rate and securing the captured, suppressed pistol firmly against my thigh. I looked down at the two moaning operatives bleeding on the damp concrete. They were not hardened cartel enforcers. They were cheap, disposable muscle hired in a blind, chaotic panic. Audrey's legendary ice-cold composure was completely disintegrating. Her sprawling empire was actively suffocating under the massive federal freeze, and she had abandoned all pretense of sophisticated corporate subtlety. I cautiously approached the leader, who lay groaning through his shattered jaw. I knelt beside him, keeping my weapon leveled directly at his head to ensure absolute compliance. I did not ask him pointless questions about his employer. Professional extraction teams operating on emergency high-risk timelines always relied on untraceable communication devices to receive their final operational directives. I drove my knee firmly into his chest, pinning him to the floor, and searched the deep internal pockets of his tactical jacket. My fingers brushed against the hard plastic casing of a cheap prepaid burner phone. I pulled it free and stood back up, retreating to a safe tactical distance behind the concrete pillar. The screen of the device was locked, but a new notification banner glowed brightly against the dark background. The message was sent from a heavily encrypted overseas routing number, but the venomous commanding syntax belonged exclusively to the billionaire matriarch of Vanguard Estates. She had not dispatched these men to secure my legal signature or negotiate the withdrawal of the federal injunction. That was simply the convenient lie she fed her disposable thugs to ensure they approached me with overconfident arrogance. I swiped the notification panel downward to reveal the full unredacted text message. The digital letters glowed with a chilling absolute finality. The directive from Audrey read exactly, "Kill the old man and bring me his thumb to unlock his encrypted drives." I stared at the illuminated screen, the cold reality of her ultimate escalation setting in completely. She did not want compliance or a legal settlement. She wanted a biological key to manually bypass the biometric security protocols on my digital servers. She had officially authorized my brutal mutilation and murder to reclaim her frozen billions. I pocketed the burner phone and turned my back on the moaning attackers. The war had permanently crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I left the two neutralized operatives groaning on the damp concrete of the subterranean parking garage. I did not call the local municipal police or attempt to interrogate the shattered men further. Local law enforcement was a thoroughly compromised apparatus, and handing them the captured burner phone would merely provide Audrey's embedded fixers with a golden opportunity to erase the digital evidence. I drove directly to the secure federal safe house where Arthur Hayes was actively coordinating our offensive strike. I dropped the plastic device onto the scarred metal desk in front of him. The screen remained brilliantly illuminated, displaying Audrey's explicit, undeniable command to amputate my thumb and execute me on sight. Hayes stared at the glowing text in absolute silence. The retired prosecutor did not express shock, moral outrage, or panic. He instantly recognized the immense tactical magnitude of her unforced error. Audrey had completely abandoned her meticulously constructed layers of corporate deniability. In her blind panic to regain control of her frozen assets, she had directly authored a brutal assassination order on an untraceable network, fundamentally underestimating our ability to intercept the transmission. Hayes immediately secured the device inside a sterile evidence bag. He bypassed the local judicial hierarchy, entirely refusing to engage with the corrupted state judges Audrey had kept heavily subsidized on her payroll for decades. He contacted the United States Attorney's Office in the Capitol, leveraging his extensive, untarnished federal network to secure an immediate audience. He presented the digital extraction with cold legal precision. The text message was not merely a personal threat. It was a documented, irrefutable act of interstate conspiracy to commit capital murder directly linked to an ongoing federal racketeering investigation. The sheer, terrifying brutality of the directive forced the district attorney to act with unprecedented, devastating speed. They convened an emergency grand jury in a secure closed session within the hour. The federal prosecutor weaponized Audrey's own violent hubris, utilizing the assassination order to justify an emergency, unredacted federal subpoena. The scope of the warrant was absolute. It entirely bypassed the standard domestic banking firewalls and targeted her highly shielded offshore financial fortresses. The subpoena demanded immediate total access to the hidden personal accounts Audrey utilized to fund her illicit security operations. The federal mandate slashed through international banking privacy laws. We forced the government to pry open the billionaire's vault. The federal subpoena immediately triggered a devastating, unrelenting forensic audit. A specialized unit of Department of Justice financial analysts descended upon Vanguard Estates' server architecture with terrifying surgical precision. They did not simply review the sanitized public-facing ledgers that Audrey's corporate accountants meticulously prepared for standard tax compliance. They deployed advanced algorithmic tracing software to violently slice through the immense labyrinth of corporate red tape, bureaucratic delays, and international offshore obfuscation. I stood silently in the secure federal command center alongside Hayes, watching the raw decrypted data stream rapidly across the primary tactical monitors. The auditors systematically dismantled Audrey's highly sophisticated financial camouflage piece by piece. They relentlessly mapped the origin points of her vast wealth, following the illicit money backward through a dense, dizzying web of anonymous shell companies, blind trusts, and offshore holding corporations. Every single time Audrey had attempted to bury her capital, she had unwittingly left a permanent, unalterable digital footprint. The federal analysts tracked massive currency transfers bouncing rapidly from the Cayman Islands to Swiss depositories, and then routing seamlessly through dummy corporations registered in the British Virgin Islands. The sheer staggering complexity of the laundering apparatus was designed specifically to exhaust and bankrupt any standard municipal investigation. But the federal audit was entirely silent, completely relentless, and absolutely immune to Vanguard's usual corporate intimidation tactics. The analysts aggressively stripped away the fraudulent layers of false commercial real estate developments, exposing the empty municipal lots and entirely fabricated building projects utilized exclusively to wash the international cartel's illicit narcotics revenue. As the financial analysts dug deeper into the historical architecture of Vanguard Estates, the central focus shifted from recent cartel laundering directly to the bedrock foundation of the syndicate. They began painstakingly reconstructing the financial genesis of Audrey's empire, tracking the very first injections of capital that had magically elevated her from a struggling local developer to a dominant, untouchable corporate titan. The digital trail narrowed considerably, pointing directly toward a series of heavily guarded, highly classified transactions executed exactly 20 years ago. The federal auditors isolated a single, deeply buried offshore account that had served as the original financial anchor for the entire Vanguard operation. The complex web of shell companies was rapidly unraveling, pulling the absolute, undeniable truth violently out of the shadows. The lead forensic accountant formally isolated the foundational ledger and projected the data onto the main tactical display. The entire federal command center fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The digital records brightly illuminated the exact genesis of Vanguard Estates. 20 years ago, Audrey had not secured a brilliant venture capital loan or a massive domestic banking investment to launch her dominant real estate firm. She had utilized a massive singular injection of highly protected, untraceable cash to establish her initial shell companies. The auditors aggressively pulled the unredacted deposit records directly from the primary offshore account. The exact unrounded monetary figure flashed across the high-definition screen in stark white text. Hayes placed his hands flat against the edge of the table, his posture turning instantly rigid. I stared at the illuminated numbers, feeling a cold, paralyzing clarity wash completely over my mind. The initial seed money used to forge the Vanguard empire matched the exact precise amount of the massive fraudulent life insurance payout collected in 1994. The numbers were utterly identical, verified down to the final decimal point. Audrey had not simply recruited my son to serve as a convenient, disposable corporate proxy for her international cartel operations. She had meticulously orchestrated Jordan's fabricated drowning specifically to harvest the massive corporate insurance payout. She had personally engineered the river accident, secured the fraudulent municipal death certificate through bribery, and seamlessly funneled the resulting blood money directly into her fledgling real estate syndicate. My son's staged death was not a desperate, chaotic escape from crippling debt. It was a highly calculated, cold-blooded corporate acquisition. Audrey had fundamentally stolen my child, weaponized my profound, paralyzing grief, and converted my decades of mourning directly into the foundational capital of her billionaire empire. She had built her entire towering reign of power directly on the empty grave of a boy who never actually died. The staggering, unprecedented cruelty of the deception completely eclipsed the cartel money laundering and the subsequent assassination attempts. Pierce Waverly was not just a terrified hostage trapped inside a golden cage. He was the primary biological asset that had originally purchased the cage itself. I turned slowly away from the illuminated monitors. The federal indictment for racketeering was no longer sufficient. Audrey had stolen my family. I was going to systematically eradicate hers. Pierce Waverly sprinted through the opulent, deserted corridors of the Vanguard Estates executive penthouse. The usual army of private security contractors and sycophantic personal assistants had completely vanished, abandoning their posts the exact moment the internal corporate servers crashed into federal lockdown. Pierce shoved open the heavy mahogany doors to Audrey's private sanctum without knocking. He intended to demand an immediate extraction strategy, relying on the woman who had orchestrated his entire fraudulent existence to shield him from the collapsing syndicate. He froze the instant he crossed the threshold. Audrey was not furiously barking orders into a telephone or coordinating a high-level legal defense. She stood perfectly still behind her expansive desk, staring blankly at a glowing red monitor that signaled the absolute death of her empire. Pierce stepped further into the dim room, his eyes scanning the chaotic disarray surrounding her desk. Two massive, black leather travel cases sat packed and zipped near the private elevator access. A sheaf of printed aviation documents lay carelessly discarded across the polished wood surface. Pierce snatched the papers, his hands trembling violently as he processed the highly classified logistical data. It was an expedited, untraceable flight plan, charting a direct route to a non-extradition territory in South America. He flipped frantically to the passenger manifest. A cold, paralyzing sickness flooded his chest, radiating down to his fingertips. The official document listed a single passenger. Audrey had authorized the immediate fueling of the corporate jet entirely for herself. Pierce looked up from the damning papers, staring at the woman he had obeyed for 20 years. The devastating reality of the cartel money laundering operations and the federal indictment snapped into brutal focus. Audrey had never intended to protect him. She had meticulously engineered his stolen identity to serve as the ultimate disposable corporate buffer. He was the designated target to absorb the full crushing weight of the federal racketeering charges and the inevitable cartel retaliation. She had packed her bags to vanish into the international shadows, leaving her fabricated husband trapped behind to face life in a maximum security penitentiary. He dropped the flight manifest onto the floor. He did not scream or demand an explanation. The absolute silent confirmation of her ultimate betrayal severed the last remaining thread of his loyalty to Vanguard Estates. Pierce turned his back on Audrey and bolted from the penthouse suite. The primal instinct for survival completely overrode decades of manufactured corporate discipline. He bypassed the main executive elevators, sprinting down the concrete emergency stairwell to reach his private secondary office on the floor below. He locked the heavy door behind him and moved directly to the biometric wall safe concealed behind a massive oil painting. He pressed his trembling thumb against the scanner. The steel door clicked open, revealing the emergency contingency fund Audrey had mockingly permitted him to maintain. Pierce grabbed a dark canvas duffel bag and frantically stuffed it with bundled stacks of untraceable $100 bills. He did not bother counting the currency. He knew he possessed roughly $2 million in raw cash, enough to bribe a pilot, and vanish across the southern border before the Department of Justice officially locked down the national airspace. He slung the heavy bag over his shoulder and fled the Vanguard Tower through the subterranean loading dock. He hijacked a low-profile maintenance vehicle from the corporate fleet, entirely abandoning his recognizable luxury sedan. He navigated the dark, rain-slicked city streets with reckless, panicked speed. He constantly checked his rearview mirror, terrified of seeing the flashing lights of federal marshals or the dark, unmarked vehicles of cartel cleaners. He knew Audrey's private charter jet was currently sitting fully fueled at a discreet secondary airstrip located 30 miles outside the city limits. He intended to beat her to the tarmac, commandeer the aircraft using his executive authority and the duffel bag of cash, and launch the plane before she ever reached the perimeter gates. He pushed the maintenance vehicle to its mechanical limits, tearing down the desolate, winding access road that led toward the private hangars. The towering chain-link security fence loomed in the darkness ahead. Pierce slammed the vehicle through the automated access gate, shattering the wooden barrier into splinters. He ignored the blaring municipal proximity alarms and drove wildly toward the illuminated runway where the sleek twin-engine corporate jet stood idling in the freezing mist. The auxiliary power unit whined loudly, signaling the aircraft was completely prepped for an immediate, unauthorized departure. He slammed the brakes, grabbing his canvas bag of cash, ready to sprint up the lowered boarding stairs. Pierce kicked the driver's side door open and scrambled out onto the wet, freezing tarmac. The heavy canvas bag slapped against his hip as he broke into a frantic sprint toward the idling jet. He focused entirely on the open cabin door, calculating the exact amount of cash required to force the private pilot to initiate an immediate blind takeoff. He covered 20 yards before the blinding glare of high-beam headlights abruptly illuminated the dark runway. Pierce stopped dead in his tracks, his expensive boots skidding slightly against the damp concrete. He threw his arm up to shield his eyes from the intense, aggressive light. A vehicle was parked perfectly horizontally across the center of the tarmac, completely obstructing the jet's takeoff path. It was not a sleek Vanguard security transport or a heavily armored federal command unit. As his eyes adjusted to the piercing glare, the familiar, battered silhouette of a 10-year-old municipal sedan materialized through the swirling mist. Pierce felt the remaining oxygen leave his lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The heavy duffel bag slipped from his shoulder, dropping onto the wet concrete with a dull thud. Dominic stood leaning casually against the hood of the old vehicle. He did not hold a weapon. He wore the same worn, unremarkable coat he had worn during their encounter in the subterranean bunker. The impoverished old man had not utilized a massive team of expensive corporate fixers or violent cartel enforcers. He had relied exclusively on decades of hardened tactical discipline to predict his son's desperate escape route. Dominic had calculated Audrey's betrayal, mapped the secondary airstrip, and positioned himself as the final, inescapable wall. The roaring turbines of the jet masked the heavy silence stretching between them. Pierce stared at the man whose grief he had monetized to build a fraudulent billionaire empire. He looked at the unyielding, resolute posture of a father who had systematically dismantled a multi-billion-dollar syndicate armed with nothing but absolute truth and unrelenting patience. Pierce looked back at the idling plane, then down at the bag of useless cash resting by his boots. The grand, arrogant illusion of Pierce Waverly completely shattered on the freezing runway. He was finally out of money, out of lies, and entirely out of time. He stood shivering in the rain, waiting for Dominic to speak. The heavy canvas duffel bag slipped entirely from Pierce's trembling fingers. It struck the wet concrete with a dense, muted thud, spilling bundles of useless, untraceable currency across the freezing tarmac. The roaring turbines of the idling private jet behind him seemed to fade into a hollow, distant echo. He stared at Dominic, fully expecting to see explosive rage, hatred, or violent vindication in the old man's eyes. Instead, he saw only the cold, unyielding judgment of a father looking at a complete stranger. That absolute, terrifying stillness shattered the last remaining fragment of the billionaire persona. The immaculate, untouchable facade of Pierce Waverly disintegrated completely. His expensive tailored coat absorbed the freezing mist as his knees violently buckled beneath him. He collapsed directly onto the unforgiving asphalt, no longer a corporate titan, but a terrified, broken boy who had finally run out of places to hide. The physical impact with the ground sent a shockwave through his body, breaking the heavy dam of repressed emotion he had maintained for 2 decades. He bowed his head, his face hovering inches above the wet pavement, and began to weep. The sound was ragged and pathetic, tearing through his chest with forceful intensity. He clawed at the damp concrete, entirely unable to look up at the man he had betrayed. The apologies spilled from his lips in a chaotic, desperate torrent. He begged for forgiveness for the 20 years of absolute silence. He wept for the agonizing grief he had intentionally inflicted upon his own family. He apologized for his profound, catastrophic cowardice. He sobbed, his voice cracking and breaking under the crushing weight of his monumental deception, confessing that he had been too paralyzed by fear to face the consequences of his own failures. The rain mixed freely with the tears streaming down his face, soaking his collar and chilling him to the bone. He remained on his hands and knees in the pooling water, a pathetic silhouette illuminated by the harsh glare of the sedan's headlights. He offered no excuses for the pain he had caused, only a desperate, suffocating remorse that had festered inside him since the day he agreed to vanish. He waited for a hand to pull him up or a voice to offer comfort, but Dominic remained perfectly still against the hood of the car, watching the display of shattered pride with absolute, uncompromising silence. Pierce slowly lifted his head, his face pale and contorted with an exhausting mixture of fear and profound shame. He remained on his knees, his hands resting flat against the wet tarmac, and began to systematically unravel the architecture of his 20-year disappearance. He confessed the absolute truth, stripping away the carefully constructed corporate mythology. Before the drowning, before the Vanguard empire, he had plunged into a catastrophic spiral of illegal gambling and reckless investments. He admitted he owed millions of dollars to a syndicate of incredibly violent, unforgiving loan sharks. They had promised to butcher him and systematically dismantle his family if he did not produce the capital immediately. He was utterly trapped, facing imminent execution. That was when Audrey's family intervened. They did not step out of the shadows to save him. They recognized a desperate, highly exploitable asset and moved to purchase his debt entirely. They bought his life from the loan sharks, securing absolute ownership of his future. They orchestrated the tragic boating accident, fabricating a flawless narrative of a tragic drowning. The massive life insurance payout triggered by his supposed death provided the exact foundational capital they required to launch their illicit real estate laundering operations. Pierce explained that he was immediately relocated, scrubbed of his true identity, and forcefully rebuilt as Pierce Waverly. He traded a physical execution for a permanent psychological prison. He described the sprawling Vanguard penthouse not as a trophy, but as a hermetically sealed golden cage. Audrey's family positioned him as the charismatic, public-facing chief executive officer, utilizing his polished facade to attract legitimate corporate investors and municipal contracts. Behind his manufactured image, they operated a massive, brutal cartel laundering pipeline. He was utterly powerless, explicitly threatened with exposure and death if he ever attempted to contact his father or deviate from the corporate script. He signed the documents they placed in front of him. He smiled for the financial magazines. He lived every single day in a state of suffocating terror, knowing that he was the ultimate disposable liability. He confessed that the luxury, the private jets, and the billions of dollars were nothing but heavy gilded chains. He had traded his soul, his family, and his identity simply to survive, allowing a ruthless syndicate to build an international criminal empire directly upon his stolen grief. Dominic did not shift his weight or alter his cold, observant posture. He listened to the entire agonizing confession without offering a single word of interruption, validation, or sympathy. He stood like a judge presiding over a finalized execution. As Pierce's voice trailed off into a series of shallow, defeated sobs, Dominic slowly reached into the pocket of his worn coat. He did not pull out a weapon. He extracted a small, high-definition digital audio recorder. The red indicator light glowed steadily in the mist. He had meticulously documented every single word of the full confession, securing the final undeniable piece of evidence required to permanently bury the Vanguard enterprise and completely exonerate himself. Dominic looked down at the kneeling man, his expression devoid of any paternal warmth. He spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that easily pierced the mechanical roar of the jet engines. He informed Pierce that tears and belated apologies did not possess the power to resurrect the dead or repair decades of intentional, calculated agony. He stated firmly that remorse could not possibly erase a sprawling multi-billion-dollar graveyard built entirely on a foundation of toxic lies. The choices had been made, the damage had been inflicted, and the absolute consequences were now completely unavoidable. A low, distant sound began to bleed through the heavy, damp air. The sharp, oscillating wail of municipal police sirens echoed across the dark surrounding hills. The sound multiplied rapidly, growing significantly louder and more aggressive with every passing second. Flashing red and blue lights began to fracture the darkness at the far edge of the private airstrip, illuminating the shattered wooden security gate Pierce had destroyed during his panicked arrival. The federal marshals and local tactical units were converging on the tarmac with overwhelming speed, drawn directly by the unsealed federal indictments and the undeniable evidence extracted from the cartel ledgers. The perimeter was entirely locked down. There were no secondary escape routes, no corporate lawyers, and no untraceable offshore accounts left to leverage. Pierce stared at the approaching convoy of law enforcement vehicles, the harsh strobe lights reflecting vividly in his terrified eyes. Dominic pressed the stop button on the digital recorder and slipped the device safely back into his pocket. He remained standing directly in front of the aircraft, ensuring the trap was perfectly sealed as the criminal empire finally collapsed. The Vanguard Estates corporate atrium was a soaring cathedral of reinforced glass and imported steel designed specifically to project an aura of absolute invulnerability and limitless power. Early morning sunlight fractured through the towering skylights, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floor. Audrey stood rigidly at the apex of the sweeping central staircase, staring down at the dense, restless sea of local and national media correspondents. The harsh, relentless glare of dozens of camera flashes reflected brightly off her immaculate tailored charcoal suit. She betrayed absolutely no physical sign of the catastrophic panic that had entirely consumed her the previous night. Her massive offshore accounts were frozen. Her brutal execution squad had been completely dismantled, and her private jet had been permanently seized by federal authorities on a dark tarmac. Yet she maintained a terrifying predatory composure. She gripped the sharp edges of the polished wooden podium until her knuckles turned white and leaned aggressively into the dense array of microphones. She initiated her final desperate tactical maneuver. With a voice dripping with perfectly manufactured sorrow and righteous indignation, she publicly addressed the sudden, highly visible federal raid on her corporate headquarters. She entirely bypassed any mention of the decrypted cartel ledgers, the international narcotics laundering, or the violent enforcement operations. Instead, she laid the entirety of the blame directly at the feet of the man she had installed as her puppet. She painted a vivid, entirely fictitious portrait of a rogue chief executive officer who had systematically embezzled billions of dollars from the company over the last decade. She claimed Pierce Waverly had manipulated complex internal audits, established illegal offshore accounts without the executive board's knowledge, and meticulously framed her innocent family to cover his own colossal financial crimes. She declared passionately that she was a victim of a devastating, deeply personal betrayal of trust. She promised full, transparent cooperation with the Department of Justice to bring the rogue executive to swift justice. She wielded her polished lies with surgical precision, attempting to sever the burning limbs of her criminal empire to save the head. She genuinely believed that if she could simply control the immediate public narrative, her army of high-priced legal fixers could still secure a narrow technical path to survival. She looked out at the cameras, projecting the image of a betrayed corporate leader completely unaware that her destruction was already seated in the room. I sat completely motionless in the center of the front row of the press pit, surrounded by frantic journalists typing furiously on their digital recording devices. I wore the exact same worn, heavy coat I had worn to the subterranean parking garage in the freezing, rain-slicked airstrip. I did not belong in this pristine cathedral of corporate wealth, and my silent presence was a glaring, undeniable anomaly amidst the polished reporters. Audrey's eyes swept methodically across the captive audience to project authoritative confidence, and her calculated gaze abruptly collided directly with mine. The vibrant color drained instantly from her perfectly contoured face. Her commanding voice faltered mid-sentence, the polished lie dying completely in her throat. She recognized me immediately as the impoverished investigator she had explicitly ordered her tactical operatives to brutally mutilate and assassinate just hours prior. I did not flinch, or offer any smug expression of triumph. I simply held her terrified gaze, forcing her to fully absorb the absolute, inescapable certainty of her impending destruction. Without breaking eye contact for a fraction of a second, I reached my right hand deep into my coat pocket and blindly pressed a single pre-programmed button on my encrypted cellular phone. It was the designated tactical signal to Arthur Hayes, who was currently stationed inside a secure, heavily armored federal vehicle parked directly outside the glass atrium walls. Hayes executed the final command instantly. He triggered a massive automated digital distribution protocol that we had prepared specifically for this moment. Simultaneously, the cellular phones of every single journalist, financial correspondent, and media executive in the crowded room vibrated with a high-priority alert. Hayes had just transmitted a comprehensive, unencrypted digital dossier directly to their private professional inboxes. The massive digital package contained the complete unredacted cartel laundering ledgers, the irrefutable scientifically verified DNA evidence proving Pierce Waverly's fabricated identity, and the pristine high-definition audio recording of Pierce's total sobbing confession on the dark runway. The abrupt synchronized chorus of hundreds of notification chimes echoed loudly through the suddenly silent atrium. The journalists stopped looking at the podium and stared intently down at their illuminated screens. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted violently as the reporters opened the files, read the transcripts, and realized they were physically holding the absolute, undeniable proof of the greatest corporate criminal conspiracy in modern history. The collective murmur of the press corps rapidly escalated into a deafening roar of realization. The heavy, reinforced glass doors of the Vanguard Estates atrium burst open with a violent, shattering force that silenced the shouting journalists. A heavily armed tactical unit of federal agents flooded into the opulent lobby, moving with overwhelming speed and absolute operational dominance. The lead agents bypassed the velvet security barricades entirely and marched aggressively up the marble staircase directly toward the wooden podium. The reporters scrambled backward in a chaotic wave, clearing a wide, unobstructed path as the federal officers converged rapidly on the billionaire matriarch. The lead agent forcefully grabbed Audrey by the upper arm, spinning her violently around and securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The pristine, untouchable facade finally shattered completely into jagged pieces. Audrey lost her manufactured composure, screaming furiously at the arresting agents, threatening them with total career ruin, and frantically demanding immediate contact with her defense attorneys. The frantic journalists surged forward like a tidal wave, their camera flashes exploding in a blinding, relentless strobe effect that permanently captured the exact humiliating moment her criminal empire fell. As the federal agents dragged the thrashing, screaming billionaire down the marble steps, the main lobby doors slid open again. Two federal marshals escorted Pierce Waverly into the building, his hands and feet heavily bound in thick, rattling steel transport chains. His incredibly expensive suit was ruined, deeply stained with the damp dirt and engine oil from the freezing airstrip. He looked broken, physically exhausted, and entirely defeated by the weight of his own cowardice. As the marshals led him firmly toward the waiting transport vehicles, Pierce lifted his heavy head and caught my eye across the chaotic, brightly lit lobby. He stopped walking, forcing the marshals to halt behind him. He looked at me with a desperate, silent plea for mercy, his eyes silently begging for a final gesture of paternal forgiveness or a simple nod of understanding. I stared back at the man who had willingly traded his soul and weaponized my decades of grief for a golden, blood-soaked cage. I felt absolutely no anger, no lingering sorrow, and absolutely no pity. I offered him nothing. I turned my back completely on him, on the screaming billionaire, and on the smoldering ruins of the Vanguard Syndicate. I walked deliberately through the shattered glass doors and stepped out into the bright, warming light of the morning sun. The air was clean, the sprawling city was awake, and for the first time in 20 agonizing years, my mind was entirely at peace. I navigated my worn 10-year-old sedan out of the sprawling financial district, leaving the chaotic swarm of federal tactical vehicles and shrieking municipal sirens entirely behind me. I did not drive to the bustling federal courthouse to observe Audrey's formal arraignment, nor did I seek out Arthur Hayes to celebrate the absolute destruction of the Vanguard Syndicate. I drove steadily toward the quiet, unremarkable suburban street where I had spent the last 2 decades nursing a phantom wound. The morning commute traffic flowed past me in a mundane, predictable rhythm. The ordinary citizens of the city were completely unaware that a multi-billion-dollar cartel laundering operation had just been violently decapitated in their own backyard. I pulled into my narrow driveway and parked beneath the shade of the large oak tree. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. I stepped out onto the damp pavement and walked up to my front door. The interior of my modest house was exactly as I had left it. The silence inside was no longer heavy with unresolved grief or the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. It was the pure, resonant silence of absolute closure. I walked into the kitchen and systematically brewed a dark pot of coffee. I moved with calm, deliberate precision. I turned on the small television resting on the counter. Every major news network was simultaneously broadcasting emergency-breaking coverage of the Vanguard Estates raid. Aerial footage displayed the massive glass-paneled corporate tower surrounded by an impenetrable perimeter of flashing federal lights. A stern-faced anchor detailed the unsealed racketeering indictments, the offshore money laundering schemes, and the shocking arrest of billionaire Audrey Vanguard alongside her chief executive officer, Pierce Waverly. They displayed high-definition photographs of the two executives being escorted into armored federal transports in heavy steel chains. I watched the broadcast with clinical detachment. The man on the screen was a convicted felon facing multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security penitentiary. He was a stranger who had willingly traded his identity for a gilded cage. He was no longer my son. I poured the steaming coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and walked slowly out to the back porch. The pale morning sunlight warmed the worn wooden planks beneath my feet. I sat in my usual chair and looked out over the small, meticulously maintained garden. The agonizing 20-year war was decisively over. I had not sought vengeance for a murdered child. I had executed a calculated, ruthless correction to a profound cosmic imbalance. Audrey believed that immense wealth granted her the divine right to purchase human lives and manipulate grief for profit. She was currently discovering that federal concrete and steel bars recognized no tax brackets. Jordan had made his choice 20 years ago, electing to discard his family to escape the consequences of his own cowardice. I had finally made my choice today. I severed the toxic bond completely. I lifted the warm mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The air was crisp and clean. The crushing burden of the past had finally evaporated, leaving behind a profound, unshakable tranquility. I sat alone on the porch watching the morning fully bloom, entirely satisfied with the new, quiet reality I had fiercely reclaimed. True strength does not roar from the top of a corporate tower. It waits silently in the shadows of patience and absolute resolve. We often mistake wealth and aggressive posturing for genuine power, but greed inevitably builds its own gilded cage. When a person values currency over basic human decency, they forfeit the loyalty of those who truly matter. Boundaries are the armor of the righteous. You cannot rescue someone who actively chooses the darkness. Walking away from toxic betrayal is never a defeat. It is the ultimate victory, a profound reclamation of your personal dignity and quiet inner peace. If you found this story compelling and resonated with the themes of justice, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your peace, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect your own dignity? Let me know where you are listening from and join us for the next life story.